The Duke stood at the altar in a coat that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, about to marry a woman he didn't love while the only person who'd ever made him feel alive watched from the servants' corridor with tears streaming down her face. This is a story about power, betrayal, and the brutal cost of choosing duty over your own heart. But before Adrian Blackwood lost everything that mattered, before Lillian Hart learned that love could be both salvation and destruction, there was a single moment when everything could have been different. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The first time Adrian Blackwood truly saw Lillian Hart, she was on her knees scrubbing blood from the marble floor of his entrance hall. It wasn't her blood. It belonged to a stable hand who'd been kicked by one of Adrian's thoroughbreds, a vicious gray mare worth more than the boy's entire family would earn in 3 generations. The household staff had scattered the moment Adrian's boots echoed through the corridor, everyone except the girl with her sleeves rolled up and her hands raw from the lye soap. She didn't look up. Adrian stopped. He'd walked these halls 1,000 times, past 100 servants who'd pressed themselves against walls or dropped into curtsies so deep their foreheads nearly touched their knees. This one just kept scrubbing, her dark hair falling loose from its pins, one stubborn piece stuck to her damp neck. "You," he said. Her hands stilled. Slowly, she sat back on her heels and raised her eyes, not all the way to his face, that would have been too bold, but to somewhere around his chest. Close enough. "Your Grace." Her voice was steady. That surprised him. "The boy, is he alive?" "Yes, Your Grace. Cook's daughter is stitching him up in the kitchen. He'll keep the leg if infection doesn't set in." Adrian nodded. He should have walked away then. He had correspondence waiting, contracts to review, a meeting with his steward about the northern tenant farms. Instead, he found himself studying the way her collar sat slightly crooked, the small burn scar on her left wrist, the fact that despite kneeling in a puddle of someone else's blood, her spine was absolutely straight. "What's your name?" A pause. "Lillian, Your Grace, Lillian Hart." "How long have you worked here, Lillian Hart?" 3 years next month." 3 years. He'd lived in this house his entire life, 29 years of walking these same corridors, and he'd never noticed her. The realization sat uncomfortably in his chest. "Stand up." She did smoothly, without using her hands for balance. When she was upright, the top of her head barely reached his shoulder. She was younger than he'd thought, maybe 22 or 23, with a smudge of something dark on her cheekbone and eyes that were... He stopped that thought before it could finish forming. "The floor can wait," he said. "Go clean yourself up." "The blood will set, Your Grace." "I'm aware of how blood works." The words came out sharper than he'd intended. "I'm telling you to go." Something flickered across her face. Not fear, which he was used to, but something closer to calculation, like she was trying to figure out what game he was playing. Finally, she dropped into a curtsy that was technically perfect, but somehow felt mocking. "As you wish, Your Grace." She gathered her bucket and rags and disappeared through the servant's door. Adrian stood there longer than he should have, staring at the half-cleaned floor, at the pink-tinged water still pooling in the grout lines. Then he went to his study and didn't think about her again. That was a lie. He thought about her constantly. 2 weeks later, Adrian's oldest friend arrived unannounced at 9:30 in the evening, drunk and grinning like he'd just won at cards. "Christ, Adrian, you look like you're preparing for a funeral." Marcus Thorne threw himself into one of the leather chairs by the fireplace, not bothering to remove his muddy boots. "Please tell me you have brandy. Good brandy, not that swill you serve at those dinners where everyone pretends to care about crop rotation." Adrian poured 2 glasses without comment and handed one over. Marcus was the second son of an earl, which meant he had a title but no real responsibilities and spent most of his time pursuing both with equal enthusiasm. They'd known each other since childhood, back when Adrian still thought life might offer him choices. "You heard about Whitmore?" Marcus asked. "The bankruptcy? Complete ruin. Lost everything except the house, and that's only because it's entailed. Wife left him, took the children." Marcus swirled his brandy, watching the light catch in the amber liquid. "He put a pistol in his mouth last Thursday." Adrian's hand tightened on his glass. "I hadn't heard that part. They're keeping it quiet. Suicide's bad for property values, you know." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "His mistake was trusting the wrong people. got involved with some scheme in the textile industry, thought he could double his money in 6 months. Instead, his partners embezzled everything and left him holding the debt. There's a lesson in that. Several, probably. Marcus took a long drink. The main one being that none of us are as safe as we think we are. One bad decision, one misplaced trust, and he made a gesture like something exploding. They sat in silence for a while. The fire popped and settled. Outside, rain had started to fall, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. "Your father's planning something," Marcus said eventually. "I heard him talking to Ashworth at the club." Adrian's father had been dead for 8 years. "The old Duke," Marcus clarified. "Your uncle, whatever you call him." "I don't call him anything." Adrian's uncle, Lord Reginald Blackwood, had served as his regent until Adrian turned 25. Technically, Reginald no longer had any official power. Practically, he still controlled half the duchy's finances through a web of investments and agreements that Adrian was only beginning to untangle. "Well, he's calling you stubborn and foolish and several other things I won't repeat because we're friends, and I'm trying not to get punched tonight." Marcus leaned forward. "He's found you a wife." The brandy turned sour in Adrian's mouth. "He can find all he wants. I'm not marrying anyone." "Eleanor Voss." Adrian set down his glass carefully. "No. Her father owns half the shipping routes on the eastern seaboard. The family's got connections in Parliament, the trading companies, even the Crown. And Eleanor herself," Marcus whistled low, "beautiful, educated, charming when she wants to be. Also completely terrifying. I sat next to her at dinner once, felt like being interviewed for a position I didn't want. I said no." "Adrian," Marcus's voice lost its casual edge, "your uncle's not asking. He's already started negotiations, and from what I heard, the Voss family is very interested." "Then they can be disappointed." "This isn't about what you want. You know that." Marcus stood, pacing to the window. "Your finances are a mess. Don't give me that look. Everyone knows it. Your father made some spectacularly bad investments before he died, and you've been trying to dig out ever since. The Voss fortune could stabilize everything. The estate, the tenants, all of it. I'm aware of my situation." "Are you?" "Because from where I'm standing, you're about to throw away the solution to all your problems because of some… what? Pride? Principle?" Marcus turned back to face him. "What are you waiting for, Adrian?" "Love." The word hung in the air like smoke. "I'm waiting," Adrian said slowly, "for it to be my choice. You're a duke. You don't get choices. You get responsibilities." Marcus picked up his glass, drained it, and set it down with a sharp click. "Meet with her at least. Eleanor Voss isn't some simpering debutante. She's smart, capable. You might even like her. Get out." Marcus raised his hands in surrender. "I'm going, but think about it. That's all I'm saying." He paused at the door. "Also, your servants are stealing from you. I saw one of the maids wearing a brooch that definitely didn't come from a servant's wages." When he was gone, Adrian poured himself another drink and tried not to think about Lillian Hart's crooked collar or the way she'd looked at him like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. He failed at that too. The servants' quarters were in the east wing, up 4 flights of stairs that got narrower with each level. Adrian had never been there before. He told himself he was conducting an inspection, which was technically something a duke might do, though usually with advance notice and at a reasonable hour. It was past midnight. The hallway was dim, lit by a single lamp someone had left burning. The doors were all closed except one at the very end, where a sliver of light showed through the gap. Adrian could hear voices, low, feminine, punctuated by occasional laughter. He should leave. He knew that. Instead, he moved closer. "Doesn't matter what you think of him." That was Lillian's voice, quieter than the others, but clear. "He's the Duke. We do what he says." "Even when what he says is stupid?" Another girl, younger sounding. "He had me polish the silver in the north dining room 3 times last week. 3 times! Nobody even uses that room." "Mrs. Rotherham uses that room for inspections," Lillian said. "She's testing you, seeing if you cut corners." "How do you know that?" "Because she did the same thing to me when I started." A pause. "And because I pay attention." Someone laughed. "Lillian pays attention to everything. Haven't you noticed? She probably knows more about this house than His Grace does." Don't be ridiculous. It's true. You see everything. Like last month, when you told Cook that Lord Ashford was going to cancel his visit before he even sent the message. How did you know? His wife was pregnant and having a difficult time. It was in the society papers. I just put it together. See? Terrifying. The younger girl's voice was warm with admiration. You should be running this place, not scrubbing floors. That's not how the world works, Mary. Maybe it should be. Adrian found himself smiling despite everything. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Mrs. Rotherham, the head housekeeper, standing at the top of the stairs with her lamp raised and her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. Your Grace. She didn't curtsy. Mrs. Rotherham had worked for the Blackwoods for 40 years and considered herself above such things. Is there something you need? He had no good answer. Checking the lamps. The lamps. Fire safety. Mrs. Rotherham's expression suggested she'd heard more convincing lies from 5-year-olds. Of course, Your Grace. I'll make sure the staff is more careful in the future. Will there be anything else? It was a dismissal. Adrian took it, but as he descended the stairs, he heard Mrs. Rotherham's voice drift down from above. Lillian Hart, a word, please. Three days later, Lillian was reassigned to work in the library. It was supposed to be a punishment, Adrian learned later. The library hadn't been properly maintained in years. His father had cared nothing for books, and Adrian had been too busy trying to save the estate from financial collapse to do more than occasionally retrieve a volume on agricultural management or contract law. The room was dusty, poorly lit, and isolated from the rest of the house. Mrs. Rotherham had meant it as exile. Instead, it became the place where Adrian spent most of his time. He told himself it was practical. The library had better lighting for paperwork than his study. The silence helped him concentrate. The fact that Lillian was there, usually perched on a ladder reaching for some impossible shelf, had nothing to do with it. She didn't speak to him unless spoken to. That should have been normal. It was how servants were supposed to behave. But somehow it felt like a choice she was making rather than a rule she was following. Like she was allowing him space in her domain, but on her terms. It drove him slightly crazy. You're shelving those wrong, he said one afternoon, not looking up from the contract he was reviewing. Lillian's hands paused. I'm shelving them alphabetically by author, as you instructed, Your Grace. Within each author, they should be chronologically ordered by publication date. A long silence. Then, of course, Your Grace, I'll reorganize them. He could hear the unspoken thought. This is a waste of time and you know it. She was right. He did know it. But she climbed down from the ladder and began pulling books off the shelf anyway, stacking them on the table with quiet efficiency. Adrian tried to focus on the contract in front of him, a dispute with one of his tenant farmers about water rights, but his attention kept drifting to the way Lillian moved, all controlled precision, no wasted motion. Why were you assigned here? He asked. Her hands stilled briefly. Mrs. Rotherham thought I needed additional training in proper conduct, Your Grace. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. Adrian set down his pen. Miss Hart. She turned to face him, one hand still resting on a stack of books. In the afternoon light coming through the tall windows, he could see dust motes floating around her like a constellation. She looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. Did she punish you because of me? He asked. Lillian's expression didn't change. Mrs. Rotherham doesn't explain her decisions to me, Your Grace. That's still not an answer. Then perhaps Your Grace should stop asking questions he already knows the answer to. The words hung in the air between them. Bold, possibly grounds for dismissal, definitely beyond anything a servant should say to a duke. Adrian should have been angry. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to relief. You're not afraid of me, he said. Lillian's chin lifted slightly. Should I be? Most people are. Most people haven't spent 3 years learning that you bark orders when you're stressed, but you've never actually punished anyone for talking back. That you hate waste more than disrespect. That you stay up past midnight reading agricultural reports because you actually care what happens to your tenants, even though it would be easier not to. She paused. You're not frightening, Your Grace. You're just tired. Something in Adrian's chest cracked open. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Lillian took a step back, and he saw the calculation flash across her face, measuring the distance to the door, weighing her options. So she was afraid after all, just not of the things most people feared. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "I know." "Then why?" "Because you're looking at me like I'm a person instead of a piece of furniture, and that's more dangerous than anything else you could do." The truth of it was devastating. Adrian crossed the space between them, not touching her, but close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. "What if I can't stop?" "Looking at me like a person?" "Any of it." Lillian's eyes met his, finally, fully, and he saw his own hunger reflected back at him. "Then we're both in trouble, Your Grace." It started with conversations. Small things at first. Adrian would ask about a book, and Lillian would answer. Then she'd ask a question of her own, about a passage she'd read while dusting, or a reference she didn't understand, and he'd explain. Philosophy led to politics, politics to literature, literature to history. He learned that she'd taught herself to read by stealing newspapers from the rubbish bins, that her mother had died when she was 12, her father a year later, that she'd worked as a laundress, a kitchen maid, a seamstress before ending up at Blackwood House, that she had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them when she thought no one important was listening. "The problem with Rousseau," she said one evening, replacing a volume on the shelf, "is that he writes about the natural goodness of man while treating actual people like obstacles to his philosophy." Adrian looked up from his desk. "You've read Rousseau?" "I've read the copy you left open on the table last week, the parts that weren't too boring anyway." "I left it open so I could find my place." "You left it open because you fell asleep reading it and didn't want to admit you found it tedious." She gave him a look that was almost amused. "I put your bookmark 3 chapters back where you actually stopped paying attention." She was right. Of course she was right. "What would you prefer to read?" he asked. Lillian considered this. Something real. Stories about people who actually exist, making choices that matter. The next day, Adrian left a copy of Defoe's Moll Flanders on the library table. The day after that, he found a note tucked into the pages, written in careful script. "Better. But she makes terrible decisions." He wrote back, "That's what makes it interesting." Her response appeared that evening. "If I wanted to read about people destroying their lives through bad choices, I'd read the household accounts." Adrian laughed out loud. That was how it began. Small exchanges, notes hidden in book pages, conversations that stretched longer each day. Adrian started arriving at the library earlier, staying later. He'd moved his entire workspace there, abandoning his study completely. When Marcus visited and asked why, Adrian said it was the lighting. Marcus didn't believe him, but he didn't push. The staff noticed, of course. Servants always noticed. Adrian could feel their eyes tracking him whenever he walked toward the east wing, could hear the whispers that cut off when he entered a room. Mrs. Rotherham's disapproval radiated like heat from a stove. He didn't care. He should have. He knew the rules of his world, the invisible lines that kept everything in its proper place. Duke and servant, master and subordinate. Those lines existed for a reason, to protect both parties from exactly this kind of complication. But when Lillian smiled at something he said, when she argued with him about politics or philosophy, or the proper way to organize a library, when she looked at him like he was just Adrian and not the Duke of Blackwood with all the weight that title carried, the lines seemed less important than they used to. It was raining the night everything changed. Adrian had stayed late reviewing contracts, trying to finalize an agreement with a shipping company that might, if he was lucky, start to repair some of the damage his father's poor investments had caused. The numbers blurred together after a while. He rubbed his eyes and looked up to find Lillian standing by the window, watching the storm. "It's past midnight," he said. "You should have gone to bed hours ago." "So should you, Your Grace. I have work to finish." "You have work you're using as an excuse not to sleep." She turned from the window. "You've been reading the same page for 20 minutes." Adrian glanced down at the contract. She was right again. "How long have you been watching me?" "Long enough to know you're going to give yourself a headache." Lillian crossed to his desk and took the papers from his hands before he could protest. "These will still be here tomorrow." "You need to rest." She set the contracts aside, out of his reach. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't brought to you on a tray while you were working?" I don't remember. Exactly. She moved toward the door. I'll bring you something from the kitchen. Lillian. His voice stopped her. Stay. She turned slowly. Your Grace. Adrian. The name felt strange in his own mouth. He'd been Your Grace for so long he'd almost forgotten he had another name. When it's just us, call me Adrian. That's not appropriate. None of this is appropriate. He stood, rounded the desk, closed the distance between them. I don't care anymore. Lightning flashed outside, throwing sharp shadows across her face. Thunder followed a few seconds later, close enough to rattle the windows. You should care, Lillian said quietly. Your reputation, your position. I have spent my entire life caring about those things. About duty and reputation and making the right choices for everyone except myself. He reached out, stopped just short of touching her face. Tell me to leave you alone and I will. Tell me this is a mistake and I'll never bring it up again. But don't tell me I should care about my position more than I care about you. Her breath hitched. This can't work. I know. People will find out. Probably. You'll be forced to send me away. Not if I refuse. You can't refuse. You're the Duke. There are rules. Fuck the rules. He kissed her. For a heartbeat, she was rigid with shock. Then she softened, her hands coming up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer. She tasted like the peppermint tea she'd been drinking, and something else. Something indefinably her. Adrian's hand tangled in her hair, pins scattering to the floor as the careful arrangement came undone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lillian's eyes were wide and her lips were swollen, and she looked absolutely terrified. We can't, she whispered. We already did. Adrian, I know all the reasons this is impossible. I've been listing them to myself for weeks. He rested his forehead against hers. I don't care. I want this. I want you. Tell me you don't feel the same and I'll walk away right now. She was quiet for a long moment. The rain hammered against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a clock chimed 1. I can't tell you that, she said finally, because it would be a lie. This time, when he kissed her, she kissed him back without hesitation. They were careful, or they tried to be. Adrian stopped spending every waking moment in the library, forced himself to maintain appearances. He attended dinners with boring lords who wanted to discuss grain prices. He reviewed estate documents in his study like he was supposed to. He even made a trip to London to meet with his bankers, though the whole time he was thinking about getting back to Lillian. When they did meet, it was late at night when the rest of the house was asleep. The library became their refuge. Adrian would work while Lillian read or organized books, and sometimes they would talk for hours about nothing important, and sometimes they wouldn't talk at all. He learned that she hummed while she worked when she thought no one was listening, that she had a scar on her shoulder from a cooking accident when she was 15, that she was afraid of horses but pretended not to be because admitting fear felt like weakness. She learned that he had nightmares about his father's funeral, that he could play piano but hadn't touched the instrument in years, that he hated the portrait of himself that hung in the main hall because it made him look like a stranger. You look too serious in it, Lillian agreed one night, studying the painting with her head tilted. Like you're about to sentence someone to death. The painter said I needed to look ducal. You look constipated. Adrian pulled her away from the painting and kissed her until she was laughing against his mouth. Much better, she said when he let her breathe again. You should look like this all the time. Happy? Human. 3 months passed like that. 3 months of stolen moments and whispered conversations and carefully maintained lies. Adrian started to believe they might actually pull this off, that they could exist in this private bubble forever, untouched by the outside world. He should have known better. The first crack appeared when Lord Ashford came to visit. Ashford was one of his uncle's cronies, a pompous ass who thought his minor title made him important. He arrived unannounced one afternoon and planted himself in Adrian's study like he had every right to be there. Your uncle sent me, he said, accepting the brandy Adrian offered with the air of someone doing a favor rather than receiving one. He's concerned. My uncle is always concerned, with good reason, it seems. Ashford took a long drink. There are rumors, Blackwood. Adrian's hand tightened on his glass. There are always rumors. Not like these, Ashford leaned forward. People are talking about you and one of your servants, a maid named Hart. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. People should mind their own business, Adrian said carefully. You're a duke. You don't get to have your own business. Ashford set down his glass with a sharp click. Your uncle has arranged a meeting with the Voss family. They're expecting you in London next week. I have no interest in... What you have interest in is irrelevant. The Voss alliance is exactly what this estate needs. Eleanor Voss is beautiful, wealthy, and connected to half the powerful families in England. She's perfect. For whom? For your position, for your duty. Ashford stood. Get rid of the girl, Blackwood, quietly. Give her a reference and send her somewhere far away. Do it before this becomes a real scandal. Get out of my house. Ashford's expression didn't change. I'm trying to help you. I don't want your help. Then you're a fool. Ashford moved toward the door, paused with his hand on the handle. Your father nearly destroyed this duchy with his bad decisions. Don't make the same mistake. When he was gone, Adrian poured himself another drink and tried to convince himself that everything would be fine. It wasn't fine. Gag. The meeting with the Voss family was unavoidable. Adrian's uncle had made sure of that, invoking old contracts and obligations that Adrian couldn't ignore without essentially declaring war on half his own allies. So he went to London, attended a dinner at the Voss estate, and met Eleanor. She was everything Ashford had promised. Beautiful in a calculated way, every detail perfect from her elaborate hairstyle to her expensive gown. Educated, articulate, charming when she chose to be. She discussed politics and business with the same ease that most women her age discussed fashion, and she looked at Adrian with the cool assessment of someone evaluating a potential investment, which, he supposed, was exactly what he was. Your uncle speaks highly of you, Eleanor said over dinner, her voice carrying the kind of polish that came from expensive tutors and years of practice. My uncle has always been optimistic. He says you're trying to modernize the estate, new farming techniques, improved worker housing. Her eyes were green, he noticed. Very green. Admirable, but expensive. Progress usually is. Progress requires capital. She took a delicate sip of wine, which you don't have. Adrian should have been offended. Instead, he was almost impressed by her directness. And you do, he said. My family does. We could be mutually beneficial to each other, Your Grace. She set down her glass. I'm not interested in a love match. I assume you're not either. Why would you assume that? Something flickered across her perfect features. Because if you were, you wouldn't be here. She wasn't wrong. The dinner ended with vague promises to continue discussions. Adrian's uncle looked smug. Eleanor's father looked calculating. Eleanor herself looked like someone who'd just won a negotiation. Adrian felt sick. He returned to Blackwood House 3 days later and went straight to the library. It was past midnight. He'd been hoping Lillian would be there, even though he knew it was dangerous for her to keep coming, even though he knew everything was falling apart. She was sitting in his chair, reading by lamplight. When she looked up and saw his face, the book slipped from her hands. What happened? He told her everything. The dinner, the meeting, Eleanor's cold assessment, his uncle's maneuvering, all of it spilled out in a rush of words he couldn't stop. Lillian listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. So it's real, she said finally. The arrangement. It's not finalized, but it will be. Not a question. Adrian crossed to where she sat, dropped to his knees beside the chair. I'll find a way out of this. How? I don't know yet, but I will. Lillian touched his face, her fingers gentle. You can't refuse this. You know that. Your estate needs the money. Your people need it. I need you. Adrian, I love you. The words came out raw, unplanned. I'm in love with you. I have been for months, and I don't care if that's inconvenient or impossible or completely insane. It's true. Tears spilled down her cheeks. This isn't fair. I know. I'm nobody. I have nothing to offer you. No money, no connections, no... He kissed her, tasting salt. You're everything. They made love that night on the library floor, desperate and clumsy and perfect. Afterwards, wrapped in Adrian's coat because they'd scattered their clothes everywhere, Lillian traced patterns on his chest and tried to memorize everything about this moment. We could run, she whispered. Leave all of this behind. Go somewhere no one knows us. And live on what? I'm a duke. I don't know how to be anything else. You could learn. Adrian pulled her closer. They'd find us. My uncle wouldn't let me just disappear. And even if we did manage to hide, Lillian, you deserve better than a life spent running. I deserve you. You deserve someone who can actually be with you, publicly, properly. His voice cracked. You deserve someone who isn't going to destroy your life. Too late for that. They stayed there until dawn started to light the windows, holding on to each other like drowning people holding on to wreckage, both knowing this couldn't last, but neither willing to let go first. The next 3 weeks were torture. Adrian tried everything. He met with his bankers, looking for alternative solutions to the estate's financial problems. He reviewed every contract, every investment, looking for some way to stabilize things without the Voss fortune. He even swallowed his pride and asked Marcus for help. Nothing worked. The numbers didn't lie. Without a significant influx of capital, the estate would continue to hemorrhage money. Tenant farms would fail. Servants would lose their positions. Everything his family had built over generations would crumble, and Eleanor Voss was waiting. His uncle sent increasingly pointed letters. The Voss family sent formal inquiries. Eleanor herself sent a note, written in perfect script, asking if he'd made a decision. Adrian didn't answer. Instead, he spent every possible moment with Lillian, knowing each time might be the last. They stopped being careful. They met during the day. They spoke openly in the library. Adrian didn't care who saw anymore. The staff definitely noticed. Mrs. Rotherham's disapproval had frozen into something glacial. The other servants whispered constantly. Even Marcus, when he visited, pulled Adrian aside and warned him that he was being reckless. People are talking, Marcus said bluntly, about you and the Hart girl. If the Voss family hears about this before you've settled things, let them hear. Adrian, Marcus grabbed his arm. Think about what you're doing. You can't actually believe this has a future. Why not? Because she's a servant. Because you're a duke. Because the entire social structure of England exists specifically to prevent this kind of thing. Marcus's frustration boiled over. I know you care about her, but caring isn't enough. It's never enough. Adrian pulled his arm free. Then what is? Marcus had no answer for that. 2 days later, everything came to a head. Adrian's uncle arrived unannounced with Lord Ashford and 2 other lords in tow. They cornered him in his study, literally cornered him, blocking the door like they thought he might try to escape. The Voss family has set a deadline, his uncle said without preamble. They want an answer within the week. Accept their offer or they're withdrawing it permanently. Good riddance, Adrian said. His uncle's face reddened. You ungrateful fool! Do you have any idea what you're throwing away? My freedom, apparently. Your responsibilities. Your duty to this family, to this estate, to the hundreds of people who depend on you. His uncle slammed his hand on the desk. I have spent 8 years trying to salvage what your father destroyed. I have called in favors, made compromises, sacrificed my own interests to keep this duchy functioning. And you're going to ruin everything because of some servant girl? The room went very quiet. Careful, Adrian said softly. It's true, isn't it? Everyone's talking about it. The Duke of Blackwood, reduced to betting his own staff. Lord Ashford's voice dripped with contempt. Embarrassing doesn't begin to cover it. Adrian was across the room before he realized he'd moved, had Ashford by the throat and shoved against the wall. Say another word about her and I'll... His uncle's voice cut through the rage like ice water. And you'll what? Prove them all right? Demonstrate that you've lost complete control? Adrian's hand was shaking. Ashford's face was turning red. Everyone in the room was frozen, waiting to see if he'd actually do it. He let go. Ashford stumbled, gasping. The other lords looked somewhere between shocked and vindicated. His uncle straightened his jacket, composed once more. The wedding is set for 6 weeks from today. The Voss family has already begun preparations. You will attend. You will marry Eleanor Voss, and you will do your duty to this family. Is that understood? And if I refuse, then I will call in every debt your father accumulated. I will withdraw my support from every investment currently keeping this estate solvent. I will make sure every lord in England knows that Adrian Blackwood is an unstable, untrustworthy disgrace to his title. His uncle's voice was cold, and then I will make certain that Lillian Hart never works in a respectable household again. I'll see her reputation destroyed so thoroughly that she'll be lucky to find work in a factory, let alone anyone's home. Adrian felt the floor drop out from under him. You wouldn't. Try me. His uncle moved toward the door. 6 weeks, Adrian. I suggest you spend them preparing yourself for reality. When they were gone, Adrian stood alone in his study and finally understood what checkmate felt like. He found Lillian in the library, organizing books with mechanical precision. She didn't look up when he entered. You heard, he said. The whole house heard. Her voice was flat. Your uncle doesn't believe in quiet conversations. Adrian wanted to go to her, to hold her, to promise that everything would be okay. But lies felt obscene right now. I tried, he said instead. I tried everything I could think of. I know. If there was any other way, there isn't. She finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were red but dry. There never was. We both knew that. Lillian, don't. She held up a hand. Don't make this harder than it already is. You have to marry her. The estate needs it. Your people need it. And I... Her voice cracked. I need to leave before I watch you do it. Where will you go? I have a cousin in the north. She runs a boarding house. I can work there. Let me give you money, a reference, something. I don't want your charity, Adrian. The anger in her voice was fresh and raw. And I definitely don't want to be the servant you kept around out of guilt after you married someone else. That's not... It's exactly what would happen. She crossed her arms, holding herself together by force of will. You'd try to take care of me. Make sure I was provided for. Maybe even visit sometimes when your wife wasn't paying attention. And every time I saw you, it would destroy me a little more. So this is it? You're just leaving. What choice do I have? The words exploded out of her. You think I want to go? You think I want to spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been if the world was different? I love you. I love you so much, it's killing me. But love isn't enough to change who you are, or what you owe, or how this whole system works. Adrian closed the distance between them, pulled her into his arms. She fought him for exactly 3 seconds before she collapsed against his chest, sobbing like something inside her had broken. I'm sorry, he whispered into her hair. I'm so sorry. I know. Her hands fisted in his shirt. I know you are, but it doesn't change anything. They stayed like that until the sun set and the library grew dark around them, until Lillian pulled away, wiped her eyes, and looked at him one last time. Be happy, she said, or at least try to be. Don't let this destroy you. Lillian, goodbye, Adrian. She walked out of the library, out of the house, out of his life. Adrian stood alone in the darkness and wondered if this was what his father had felt like when everything fell apart, hollow and broken and completely lost. Outside, it started to rain again. The wedding preparations consumed Blackwood House like a disease. Seamstresses arrived with bolts of silk and velvet. Florists debated centerpiece arrangements in the dining room. Mrs. Rotherham walked around with lists that seemed to grow longer by the hour, barking orders at servants who scattered like startled birds. The whole place smelled of fresh paint, an expensive perfume, and something Adrian couldn't name but recognized as the scent of inevitability. He spent most of his time in the stables. The horses didn't care that he was getting married. They didn't offer congratulations or knowing looks or helpful advice about his impending nuptials. They just existed, warm and solid and uncomplicated, and right now that was all Adrian could handle. You're avoiding people, Marcus said from the stable doorway. Adrian didn't look up from brushing down his favorite gelding, a gray named Tempest, who'd thrown 3 different stable hands but tolerated Adrian with something approaching affection. I'm caring for my horse. You've been caring for your horse for 2 hours. I'm fairly certain he's the cleanest animal in England at this point. Marcus stepped inside, wrinkling his nose at the smell of hay and manure. Your uncle's looking for you. Something about the seating arrangements. He can arrange the seating himself. That's what I told him. He didn't appreciate it. Marcus leaned against the stall door, studying Adrian with the kind of careful attention that meant he was about to say something Adrian didn't want to hear. She's gone, isn't she? The Hart girl. Adrian's hand stilled on the brush. Yes. Good. Don't. I'm not being cruel, Adrian. I'm being realistic. Marcus sighed. It's better this way. Clean break. You can move forward without what? Without feeling anything? Without remembering what it's like to actually want something for myself? Adrian threw the brush into the grooming box hard enough that Tempest shifted nervously. She's been gone 3 weeks and I still can't sleep. I can't think. Every time I walk past the library, He stopped. Saying it out loud made it too real. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm sorry, I know this is hard. Do you? No, Marcus admitted. I've never been in love with someone I couldn't have, but I've watched you these past few weeks, and... He hesitated. You look like you're dying. Adrian laughed, but there was no humor in it. Maybe I am. Then stop. Call off the wedding. Find another way to save the estate. There is no other way. There's always another way. Not one that doesn't destroy everyone who depends on me. Adrian finally turned to face his friend. You think I haven't tried? I've gone over the numbers 100 times. Without the Voss money, I'll have to sell land. That means tenant farmers lose their homes. I'll have to let staff go. People who've worked for my family for decades will be turned out with nothing. And all of it will be because I chose my own happiness over their survival. That's not fair. Life isn't fair, I'm learning that. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he pulled a silver flask from his jacket and offered it to Adrian. Drink? It's 10 in the morning. Which is precisely why you need it. Adrian took the flask and drank. The whiskey burned going down, but at least it was a different kind of pain than the one that had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Eleanor arrives tomorrow, Marcus said carefully, for the final preparations. Adrian handed back the flask. I know. Have you seen her since the dinner? Once. She came for a tour of the house, took notes on everything that needed to be changed. Changed how? Redecorated, updated, modernized. Adrian returned to brushing Tempest, needing something to do with his hands. She has very specific opinions about window treatments. Sounds delightful. She's not wrong. The house is falling apart. Half the furniture is older than I am. The curtains are moth-eaten. The whole east wing smells like mildew. He paused. She'll make a good duchess. You sound like you're trying to convince yourself. Maybe I am. They stood in silence for a while, the only sounds coming from the horses shifting in their stalls and the distant clatter of activity from the main house. You could still run, Marcus said quietly. Tonight. Just saddle Tempest and go. Where? Anywhere. Somewhere they won't find you. Adrian shook his head. I'm not my father. I won't run from my responsibilities. Even if they kill you? Even then. Marcus took another drink from his flask, longer this time. You're a better man than I am, Adrian. I'm not sure that's a compliment. After Marcus left, Adrian stayed in the stables until the sun started to set. Then he returned to the house, walked past the servants preparing the drawing room for Eleanor's arrival, climbed the stairs to his bedroom, and tried to sleep. He dreamed of Lillian. He always dreamed of Lillian. Eleanor Voss arrived the next afternoon in a carriage that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, accompanied by her mother, 2 maids, and enough luggage to outfit a small army. Adrian met them in the entrance hall, playing the role of gracious host with the ease of long practice. Eleanor stepped down from the carriage looking like she'd just come from a portrait sitting, every detail perfect, not a hair out of place despite hours of travel. Your Grace, she offered her hand. He kissed it, the gesture automatic. Miss Voss, welcome to Blackwood House. Thank you, though I suppose I should start thinking of it as my house too. She smiled, and it was charming and calculated and didn't reach her eyes. Strange, isn't it? In a few weeks, this will all be mine as much as yours. Ours, Adrian corrected automatically. Of course, ours. Her gaze swept over the entrance hall, taking in the faded wallpaper and the portrait of Adrian's grandfather that definitely needed cleaning. We have so much to discuss. The renovations alone will take months. Eleanor's mother, Lady Catherine Voss, descended from the carriage with the bearing of someone who'd never doubted her own importance. Adrian, you look well. That was a lie. He looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, because he hadn't. As do you, Lady Catherine. We're family now. You should call me Catherine. She swept past him into the house, already issuing orders to the servants about where to put the luggage. "Eleanor, darling, show me which rooms need the most work. I want to get started on the plans immediately." They disappeared into the drawing room, leaving Adrian standing in his own entrance hall, feeling like a guest in his own home. Mrs. Rotherham appeared at his elbow. "Shall I have tea sent to the drawing room, Your Grace?" "Yes, thank you." She hesitated, which was unusual. Mrs. Rotherham never hesitated. "Your Grace, if I may?" "What is it?" "Miss Hart left something for you before she departed." She produced a small envelope from her pocket. "She asked me to give it to you after Miss Voss arrived." Adrian took the envelope. His name was written on the front in Lillian's careful script. "Thank you." Mrs. Rotherham nodded and withdrew, leaving him alone with the letter. He should have opened it immediately. Instead, he tucked it into his jacket pocket and went to join Eleanor and her mother for tea. The afternoon was excruciating. Eleanor wanted to discuss everything: the wedding ceremony, the reception, the guest list, the flowers, the menu, the seating arrangements, which rooms would be hers and which would be his, and how they would handle the living arrangements going forward. "Separate bedrooms, of course," she said, as casually as if discussing the weather. "I assume that's acceptable." Adrian looked up from the tea he hadn't been drinking. "Separate? I have no interest in the traditional aspects of marriage." Eleanor set down her cup with precise care. "We're both adults. Let's not pretend this is a love match. You need my family's money. I need the social position that comes with being a duchess. Everything else is negotiable." Lady Catherine smiled approvingly. "Eleanor has always been practical." "I see." Adrian should have been relieved. Instead, he felt vaguely insulted, though he couldn't explain why. "However," Eleanor continued, "we will need to produce an heir eventually, for appearance's sake, if nothing else. I assume you understand the necessity." "I understand duty." "Good. Then we're in agreement." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "Now, I'd like to see the rest of the house, particularly the east wing. Mother mentioned it needs significant repairs." They spent the next 2 hours touring Blackwood House, while Eleanor made notes in a small leather book she carried everywhere. Everything was catalogued, assessed, judged. The library got particular attention. "This room is wasted as a library," Eleanor said, walking the perimeter with a critical eye. "No one actually reads this many books. It would make a better music room, or perhaps a second drawing room for entertaining." Adrian felt something crack inside his chest. "The library stays." "I'm sorry?" "This room, it stays as it is." His voice came out harder than intended. "Everything else you want to change? Fine. But not this." Eleanor studied him with those sharp green eyes. "Is there a particular reason?" "I work here." "You have a study for that." "I prefer the library." They stared at each other. Adrian could feel Lady Catherine watching them, evaluating, calculating. Finally, Eleanor made a small note in her book. "Very well. The library remains." She moved toward the door. "Though we really should replace these curtains. They're practically falling apart." After they left, Adrian stayed in the library alone. The room felt different with Eleanor's presence still lingering in the air, smaller somehow, less like a refuge and more like a museum exhibit of someone else's life. He pulled Lillian's letter from his pocket. The paper was cheap, the kind servants use for personal correspondence. He turned it over in his hands twice before finally breaking the seal. The letter was short. "Adrian, don't look for me. Don't try to find me. Don't send money or references or anything else that would let you feel like you're taking care of me. I need to do this on my own. I'm not angry. I need you to know that. I'm not angry at you or your uncle or even Eleanor Voss. I'm angry at the world that made this impossible, but that's not the same thing. You asked me once what I wanted to read. I told you I wanted stories about people making choices that mattered. I think I understand now why those stories are always tragedies. Because the choices that matter most are the ones that cost us everything. Be happy, or at least try. Don't let this turn you into someone you're not. I love you. I'll always love you. That's not going to change just because I'm not there to say it." L. Adrian read it 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, closest to his heart, where no one would find it. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of preparations and appearances and slowly suffocating on his own life. Eleanor moved into Blackwood House a week before the wedding. She took over the mistress's chambers, rooms that had been his mother's once, a lifetime ago, and immediately began redecorating. Servants scurried around with paint samples and fabric swatches. The smell of fresh wallpaper paste permeated everything. Adrian avoided her as much as possible, which was easier than it should have been. Eleanor was busy with her own preparations and seemed to prefer it that way. They saw each other at meals, spoke pleasantly about neutral topics, and maintained a careful distance that felt more like a business arrangement than an impending marriage, which, he supposed, was exactly what it was. His uncle visited twice to check on progress, and both times left looking satisfied. Lord Ashford came to discuss the wedding ceremony and made pointed comments about duty and responsibility that Adrian ignored. Marcus stopped by frequently, usually drunk, always trying to convince Adrian that it wasn't too late to change his mind. "You look like death," Marcus said one evening, sprawled in a chair in Adrian's study with a bottle of wine he'd brought from his own cellar. "Seriously, you're pale, you've lost weight, and I'm fairly certain you're not sleeping." "I'm fine." "You're a terrible liar." Marcus poured himself another glass. "What happens after the wedding?" "Life continues." "Does it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're planning your own funeral." Adrian didn't answer. What was there to say? The night before the wedding, Adrian couldn't sleep. He'd tried. He'd gone to bed at a reasonable hour, closed his eyes, and willed himself to rest. But every time he started to drift off, he'd see Lillian's face, or hear her voice, or remember the way she'd looked at him in the library that last night, and he'd jerk awake with his heart pounding and his chest tight. Finally, around 2 a.m, he gave up. The house was dark and quiet. The servants had all gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from the day's preparations. Today, technically, the house would be filled with guests. There would be a ceremony in the chapel, a reception in the ballroom, toasts and dancing, and all the ritual performances that came with a ducal wedding. Adrian walked through the dark halls and found himself in the library. It looked different now. Eleanor had been true to her word and left the books alone, but new curtains hung at the windows, heavy velvet things in deep burgundy that blocked out the moonlight. The desk had been moved. Someone had rearranged the chairs. Small changes, but enough to make the space feel foreign. He stood in the center of the room and tried to remember what it had felt like when Lillian was here. The sound of her humming while she worked, the way she'd argue with him about philosophy, the scrape of her shoes on the ladder rungs, the smell of the peppermint tea she always drank. All of it was gone now, replaced by Eleanor's careful improvements and the ghost of something he'd lost before he'd ever really had it. Couldn't sleep either? Adrian turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, wrapped in a silk dressing gown that probably cost more than the average servant earned in a year. Her hair was down, falling past her shoulders in waves that softened her face. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "You didn't. I was already awake." She moved into the room, trailing fingers along the spines of books as she walked. "Having second thoughts?" "About?" "Tomorrow. The wedding. All of it." Adrian considered lying, decided against it. "Yes." Eleanor nodded like he'd confirmed something she already knew. "So am I." That surprised him. "You are?" "Of course. I'm about to marry a man I barely know, tie myself to a duchy I've never lived in, and commit to a life that's been chosen for me rather than by me." She turned to face him. "I'd be an idiot not to have doubts." "Then why are you going through with it?" "Because doubts don't change reality. My family needs this alliance. Your duchy needs our money, and I—" She paused. "I've spent my entire life being groomed for exactly this kind of marriage. It would be wasteful not to use all that training." There was something almost sad in her voice, buried beneath the practical calculation. "What did you want?" Adrian asked. "Before all this, if you could have chosen anything." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, an owl called. The new curtains shifted slightly in a draft from somewhere. "I wanted to study law," she said finally. "Ridiculous, I know. Women can't be barristers. But I used to read my father's legal texts when no one was looking. I found it fascinating, the logic of it, the way arguments built on each other, the precision required." She laughed, but it sounded hollow. "My mother found out and had the books removed from my room. Said I was wasting time that should be spent on more appropriate pursuits. That's not ridiculous. It is when you're the daughter of one of the wealthiest families in England. We don't get to have impractical dreams. She met his eyes. Just like dukes don't get to marry servant girls. The words hung in the air like smoke. How did you know? Adrian asked quietly. Everyone knows. Your servants gossip, your friends gossip, your uncle certainly gossips. Eleanor moved to the window, looking out at the dark grounds. I knew before we ever had dinner that you were in love with someone else. I just didn't know if you'd be stupid enough to actually refuse me because of it. I'm not refusing you. I know. You're too responsible for that, too aware of what refusal would cost. She turned back to him. But you're thinking about her right now, wishing she was here instead of me, wondering what your life would look like if circumstances were different. She wasn't wrong. I'm sorry, Adrian said. Don't be. I don't want your apologies. Eleanor's voice was crisp, businesslike. I want your honesty. Can you do this? Can you stand at the altar tomorrow and make vows you don't mean and spend the rest of your life pretending to be something you're not? Can you? I've been pretending my entire life. I'm very good at it. She crossed her arms. But I need to know if you can hold up your end of this arrangement. Because if you can't, if you're going to spend our marriage pining for some girl you can't have, then I'd rather know now. Adrian thought about Lillian's letter, about her telling him to be happy, or at least to try, about the way she'd looked at him that last night, like she was memorizing his face for all the years ahead when she wouldn't see it. I can do my duty, he said. That's not what I asked. It's the only answer I have. Eleanor studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. That'll have to be enough. She moved toward the door, paused with her hand on the frame. For what it's worth, Adrian, I think she was very lucky to be loved like that. Most people never experience it. She didn't feel lucky. No, I imagine she felt miserable, but that doesn't change the truth of it. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be exhausting. After she left, Adrian stood alone in the library until the sky started to lighten. Then he went to his room, put on the formal clothes that had been laid out for his wedding, and prepared to make the biggest mistake of his life. The ceremony was everything a ducal wedding should be: grand, expensive, and utterly soulless. The chapel was packed with people Adrian either barely knew or actively disliked. Lords and ladies dressed in their finest, here to witness the spectacle and assess how this marriage would affect their own political calculations. His uncle sat in the front row looking triumphant. Eleanor's parents looked satisfied. Marcus, serving as his best man, looked vaguely ill. Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, looking like a painting come to life. Her dress was white silk with intricate lace details that must have taken months to create. Her veil was held in place by a diamond tiara that caught the light from the chapel windows and scattered it like stars. She was objectively beautiful. Adrian felt nothing. The ceremony passed in a blur. The priest spoke words about duty and love and commitment that felt like they were happening to someone else. Adrian made his vows in a voice that didn't sound like his own. Eleanor's responses were clear and steady, each word perfectly pronounced. When the priest told him to kiss his bride, Adrian leaned in and pressed his lips to Eleanor's. It was brief, chaste, performed for the audience rather than each other. The chapel erupted in applause. They were married. The reception was worse. Hours of standing in receiving lines, making small talk with people who all wanted something from him, smiling until his face hurt. Eleanor played her part perfectly, charming and gracious, and every inch the duchess she'd been trained to be. They danced together for the first dance, moving through the steps with mechanical precision. Eleanor was an excellent dancer. So was Adrian. They looked perfect together. He wanted to die. Smile, Eleanor murmured as they turned. People are watching. I am smiling. You look like you're being tortured. I am being tortured. Her lips twitched. At least you're honest about it. The dance ended. They separated. Adrian was immediately surrounded by lords wanting to discuss business opportunities now that he had the Voss fortune backing him. Eleanor was swept away by ladies eager to ingratiate themselves with the new duchess. Marcus appeared at Adrian's elbow sometime around midnight with a glass of champagne and a look of deep concern. You need to eat something. You've been drinking on an empty stomach for hours. I'm fine. You're swaying. Adrian realized Marcus was right. The room had started to tilt slightly. When can I leave? Not for at least another hour, maybe 2. These things have expectations. Marcus glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then lowered his voice. Are you going to survive this? Probably not. Adrian, I'm joking. He wasn't joking. I'll be fine. I just need some air. He escaped to the terrace, grateful for the cold night air and the temporary solitude. The sounds of the reception filtered through the glass doors. Music and laughter and the hum of 100 conversations happening at once. This was his life now. This performance. This carefully maintained facade. He thought about Lillian's letter, about her telling him not to let this turn him into someone he wasn't. Too late for that. There you are. Eleanor stepped onto the terrace, closing the door behind her. People are starting to ask where the groom disappeared to. Sorry, I needed a moment. Take all the moments you want. I just came to warn you that your uncle is planning to give a toast soon. You'll want to be inside for that. She joined him at the railing, looking out at the dark grounds. Though I don't blame you for hiding, this is all rather overwhelming. You seem to be handling it well. I've been trained for this since birth. You'd be surprised what you can endure with proper preparation. She was quiet for a moment. There's something you should know about the marriage contract. Adrian turned to look at her. What about it? Your uncle added some clauses, conditions on how the Voss money would be distributed. I didn't notice them until after the papers were signed. Her expression was unreadable. He's made sure that I control most of the finances. Not you, me. The world tilted again, and this time it had nothing to do with the champagne. What? The money from my family isn't going directly to the estate. It's being managed through a trust that I oversee. Your uncle convinced my father it was the more prudent approach, given your father's history of poor investments. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact. Effectively, I now control the duchy's finances. You'll need my approval for any major expenditures. Adrian felt ice forming in his veins. He gave you power over everything. Not everything. You're still the Duke. You still have the title, the authority over the land, the tenants. But yes, the money is mine to distribute as I see fit. She turned to face him fully. I thought you should know before we went any further. Why? Why tell me at all? Because I don't like being used any more than you do. Her eyes were hard. Your uncle played us both. He got exactly what he wanted, control of the duchy's finances without any of the responsibility. And he did it by convincing both our families that this was the best solution. Adrian's hands gripped the railing hard enough that his knuckles went white. How long have you known? I discovered it 2 days ago. I spent yesterday trying to find a way out of it. Her mouth twisted. There isn't one. The contracts are signed. The marriage is legal. The money is already being transferred. So what do we do? Eleanor's smile was sharp and cold and nothing like the charming expression she'd worn all evening. We make him regret it. Before Adrian could ask what she meant, the terrace doors opened and Lord Ashford stuck his head out. There you are. Your uncle's about to give his toast. You're needed inside. They returned to the ballroom. Adrian's uncle stood at the center of the room, glass raised, looking like a man who'd just won the most important game of his life. To the happy couple, he said, and everyone raised their glasses in response. May their union bring prosperity to the Blackwood name and stability to all who depend on it. Adrian drank the champagne and tasted ashes. The reception finally ended around 2 a.m. Guests began to depart, calling congratulations and well wishes as they left. Eleanor's parents were among the last to leave, her mother pulling her aside for what looked like final instructions. When everyone was finally gone, the house fell silent except for the servants cleaning up the debris of the celebration. Adrian stood in the entrance hall, still in his formal clothes, trying to figure out what happened next. Separate bedrooms, Eleanor said from behind him. Remember? He turned. She looked exhausted, the carefully maintained polish starting to crack around the edges. Right. Separate bedrooms. I'll see you tomorrow. She started up the stairs, then paused. Adrian? Yes? Your uncle made a mistake tonight. Her voice was quiet but certain. He assumed I was just another pawn he could control. He's wrong. She continued up the stairs, leaving Adrian alone in the hall. He should have gone to bed, should have tried to sleep. Instead, he found himself walking to the library one more time. Someone, probably Mrs. Rotherham, had tidied up after Eleanor's renovations. The books were perfectly organized. The desk was clear. The new curtains were drawn against the night. It looked nothing like the room where he'd fallen in love with Lillian Hart. Adrian pulled out her letter one more time, read it in the dim light of a single lamp. Then he tucked it back in his pocket, sat down at the desk, and began making a list. If Eleanor wanted to make his uncle regret his manipulations, Adrian was more than willing to help. But first he needed to understand exactly what he was up against. He worked through the night, pulling contract after contract, tracing the web of agreements and obligations his uncle had woven over the years. As the sun started to rise, painting the library in shades of gold and amber, Adrian finally began to see the pattern. His uncle hadn't just controlled the money. He'd built an entire system of dependencies and obligations that extended far beyond Blackwood House. Investments tied to key allies, debts owed by influential lords, a network of favors and threats that kept everyone in line. It was brilliant. It was also vulnerable, because systems that complex always had weak points, places where one wrong move could bring the whole thing crashing down. Adrian just had to find them. He was still working when Eleanor appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the day despite the early hour. "You didn't sleep," she observed. "Neither did you." "I was reading the contracts, all of them." She moved into the room carrying a stack of papers. "I think I found something." They spent the next hour going over documents, piecing together the full scope of what Adrian's uncle had done. It was worse than Adrian had thought, better than Eleanor had feared, complicated enough that unraveling it would take months, maybe years. "He's been embezzling," Eleanor said finally, pointing to a series of transactions that didn't add up. Small amounts spread across multiple accounts, enough that no single irregularity would raise questions, but taken together, it's fraud. Substantial fraud. And if we can prove it, we can destroy him. They looked at each other across the desk. "This will take time," Eleanor said. "We'll have to be careful, methodical. We can't let him know what we're doing until we have everything we need." "How long?" "Months at least, maybe a year." She gathered the papers. "Can you maintain appearances that long? Play the dutiful husband while we work?" Adrian thought about Lillian, about the life he'd given up, about the fact that he was already trapped in a marriage he didn't want, playing a role he'd never chosen. What was a few more months of pretending? "Yes," he said. "I can do that." "Good." Eleanor moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing. Your uncle mentioned that he'd arranged for the Hart girl to be blacklisted from respectable employment, made sure she couldn't find work anywhere that mattered." Adrian felt rage bloom in his chest, hot and immediate. "What?" "I thought you should know, in case—" She hesitated. "In case it matters to your planning." She left before he could respond. Adrian sat alone in the library as the sun climbed higher, filling the room with light that showed every detail of the space Lillian used to inhabit. The rage that had flared at Eleanor's words settled into something colder, harder, more useful. His uncle had thought he'd won, had thought he'd successfully caged Adrian, eliminated all the inconvenient complications, and secured his own position for years to come. He was wrong. Adrian pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing a new kind of list. Not contracts or investments this time, but names. People who owed his uncle favors. People his uncle had threatened. People who might be convinced to switch sides if offered the right incentives. If his uncle wanted a war, Adrian would give him one. But first, he needed to find Lillian. Finding Lillian proved harder than Adrian expected. He started with Mrs. Rotherham, who claimed she didn't know where Lillian had gone. "She left without giving a forwarding address, Your Grace. Said she wanted a clean break. She mentioned a cousin in the north." Mrs. Rotherham's expression didn't change. "She may have said something like that. I don't recall the details." She was lying. Adrian could see it in the way she wouldn't quite meet his eyes, the slight tension in her shoulders. But pushing her would only make her more stubborn, and he needed her cooperation for what came next. "If you do remember," he said carefully, "I'd appreciate knowing. There's the matter of her final wages. She left before I could settle her account properly." That was also a lie, but a useful one. Mrs. Rotherham's sense of propriety wouldn't allow an employee to go unpaid, even one who'd left under difficult circumstances. "I'll make inquiries, Your Grace." It took her 3 days to deliver an address. A boarding house in Newcastle, nearly 200 miles north. Adrian stared at the paper she handed him, at Lillian's name written in Mrs. Rotherham's precise script, and felt something loosen in his chest. "Thank you. Your Grace." Mrs. Rotherham's voice stopped him at the door. "Whatever you're planning, be careful. Miss Voss is not a woman to be underestimated." "I'm aware." "I don't think you are." She folded her hands. "I've been managing this household for 40 years. I've seen 3 dukes come and go, and I've learned to recognize when trouble is brewing. Your new wife is trouble of a very particular kind." Adrian turned back to face her. "What kind is that?" "The kind that doesn't forgive. The kind that remembers every slight and waits for the perfect moment to respond." Mrs. Rotherham's expression was grave. "You're playing a dangerous game, Your Grace. Make sure you understand the stakes." He understood them perfectly. That was the problem. Eleanor, for her part, seemed content to maintain the fiction of their marriage. They took meals together when propriety demanded it, appeared side by side at social functions, and presented a united front to the outside world. Behind closed doors, they were business partners plotting the downfall of a man who'd manipulated them both. "I found 3 more discrepancies in the Northern investments," Eleanor said one evening, spreading papers across the library desk. She'd taken to working there in the late afternoons, claiming the light was better than in her own rooms. Adrian suspected she enjoyed the irony of using his sanctuary for their conspiracy. "Your uncle's been diverting funds from the tenant improvement projects. The money that was supposed to go toward new equipment and housing repairs has been redirected to his personal accounts." "Well..." Adrian studied the numbers. "Can you prove it?" "Not yet. The transactions are cleverly disguised. But if we can get access to his private ledgers, he keeps those in his London house, under lock and guard. Then we'll need to find another way." Eleanor tapped her pen against the desk, thinking. "What about his secretary, the man who manages his correspondence?" "Thomas Whitley. He's been with my uncle for 20 years. Everyone has a price. We just need to find his." Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, for perhaps the first time since the wedding. Eleanor had changed in the weeks since they'd married. The perfect polish she'd worn like armor had developed small cracks. She worked too late, slept too little, and occasionally forgot to maintain her carefully cultivated expressions. In those unguarded moments, she looked younger, more human. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Eleanor glanced up from the papers. "Doing what?" "Helping me. You got what you wanted. The title, the position, the social standing. You could just take the money and leave me to deal with my uncle. I told you, I don't like being used. There's more to it than that." She was quiet for a moment, weighing whether to answer honestly. Finally, she set down her pen. "My father made the same kind of arrangements with me that your uncle made with you. Every decision about my life has been calculated for maximum financial and social benefit. Where I went to school, who I was allowed to befriend, what I studied, who I would marry, none of it was mine to choose." Her voice was flat, controlled. "Your uncle is just another man who thinks people are pieces on a board to be moved around for his benefit. I'm tired of being a piece. So this is revenge." "No, revenge is emotional. This is justice." She gathered the papers. "Besides, if we're going to be stuck in this marriage, we might as well make it useful." After she left, Adrian sat in the library and thought about all the different kinds of prisons people built for themselves. Eleanor and her perfect manners and calculated responses. Himself in duty and responsibility. Lillian in... He stopped that thought. Lillian had escaped. That's what mattered. Except she hadn't. Not really. Not if his uncle had poisoned her chances of finding decent work. Adrian pulled out the Newcastle address and made a decision. He left for the north 3 days later, telling Eleanor he needed to inspect the tenant farms personally. It wasn't entirely a lie. The farms did need inspection, and he made a point of visiting several on the way. But his real destination was the boarding house where Lillian had taken refuge. Newcastle was gray and industrial, all coal smoke and narrow streets packed with workers heading to and from the factories. The boarding house was in a slightly better neighborhood than Adrian had feared, but still far below anything he would have chosen for Lillian. The building was old, the paint peeling, the windows streaked with grime. He stood outside for 10 minutes, trying to figure out what he was going to say. Finally, he knocked. The woman who answered was middle-aged and suspicious. her eyes taking in Adrian's expensive clothes and private carriage with obvious distrust. "We don't want trouble." "I'm not here to cause any. I'm looking for Lillian Hart." "Who's asking?" "A friend." The woman's expression suggested she'd heard that before and didn't believe it. "Miss Hart doesn't take visitors. Please, just tell her Adrian is here. She'll see me." "She most certainly will not." The voice came from behind the landlady, and then Lillian was there, thinner than Adrian remembered, and pale but unmistakably her. She looked at him with no expression at all. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you." "Well, you've seen me. Now leave." She started to close the door. Adrian put his hand against it, not forcing but stopping. "Lillian, please, 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." "You don't get to ask me for anything." Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "You made your choice. I made mine. We're done. My uncle blacklisted you, made sure you couldn't find work." That got through. Lillian's eyes widened slightly. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been investigating everything he's done. Every manipulation, every threat, every lie." Adrian lowered his voice. "Please, let me explain." The landlady, Lillian's cousin, Adrian guessed, looked between them with sharp interest. Lillian noticed and seemed to come to some internal decision. 5 minutes, she said. "Not in here. Outside." They walked to a small park 2 streets over, neither of them speaking. It was early afternoon, and a few children were playing while their mothers watched from nearby benches. Lillian chose a spot away from everyone else and turned to face him. "You got married," she said. "Yes. How's that working out for you?" The bitterness in her voice was like a knife. "About as well as expected." "Good. I hope you're miserable." She crossed her arms. "What do you want, Adrian?" "To help you. To fix what my uncle broke." "You can't fix this. I've been to every respectable house in the city. They all turn me away the moment they hear my name. Someone's been spreading rumors that I'm a thief, that I'm unreliable, that I was dismissed for improper conduct." Her laugh was sharp. "That last one's almost funny. If only they knew." "Come back to Blackwood House." "Are you insane?" "I can protect you there, give you a position that my uncle can't touch. Eleanor knows about us. She won't object." Lillian stared at him like he'd suggested they burn down the city. "Your wife knows about us. She knows I was in love with someone else when we married. She doesn't care. The marriage it's not what you're thinking. I don't care what your marriage is or isn't." Lillian's voice rose. "I'm not coming back to watch you live your life with another woman. I'm not going to be your guilty secret tucked away in the servants' quarters. I'd rather starve." "You might actually starve. What work have you found here?" She looked away. "I'm managing." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one you're getting." She turned back to him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Why did you come here? What did you think was going to happen? That I'd be grateful? That I'd fall into your arms and everything would be like it was?" "No, I thought—" Adrian stopped, realizing he hadn't actually thought this through. "I wanted to make sure you were safe." "I'm safe. I'm surviving, and I'm doing it without you." She took a step back. "Yom, your 5 minutes are up." "Lillian, no. You don't get to do this. You don't get to show up here and tear everything open again just because you feel guilty." Her voice broke. "I loved you. I still love you, and that's exactly why you need to leave and never come back." She walked away before he could respond, her shoulders straight and her pace steady until she turned the corner and disappeared from view. Adrian stood in the park for a long time, watching the children play and trying to figure out how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. He returned to Blackwood House 2 days later to find Eleanor waiting in the library with an expression that made his blood run cold. "Where were you?" she asked. "Inspecting the northern farms. I told you." "Don't lie to me." She stood, holding a piece of paper. "Your uncle knows you went to Newcastle. He knows you were looking for the Hart girl, and now he's threatening to expose the whole affair publicly unless you cooperate with his new investment scheme." Adrian felt the ground shift beneath him. "How does he know?" Because he's been having you followed, you idiot." Eleanor threw the paper at him. It fluttered to the desk, a letter from his uncle, laying out exactly what he knew and what he wanted in exchange for silence. Did you really think you could just disappear for 3 days and no one would notice? You're a duke. You don't get privacy. I was careful. You were reckless. And now we're both paying for it. She paced the room, anger radiating from her like heat. He wants access to my family's shipping routes, wants to use them for some scheme involving textile imports from India. If we refuse, he'll make sure everyone knows about your servant girl. The scandal will destroy both our reputations. Adrian scanned the letter. His uncle's terms were clear and ruthless. Cooperation in exchange for silence. Defiance in exchange for social annihilation. We can't give him what he wants, Adrian said. I know that. But we also can't afford a public scandal right now. We're not ready. Eleanor stopped pacing. We need time to build our case against him. If he exposes you now, everything we've been working toward falls apart. So what do we do? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. Then, we give him something. Not everything he wants, but enough to make him think he's won. Buy ourselves time. That's exactly what he expects us to do. I know, but he's made a mistake, but she pointed to a paragraph in the letter. He's threatening to ruin the Heart Girl along with us. Make sure she never works again, possibly have her arrested on false charges if we don't comply. Adrian felt rage spike through him. He can't. He absolutely can. He has the connections and the money to make her life hell. Eleanor met his eyes. But that gives us leverage. Because if he's threatening her, it means he sees her as important, as something you care about enough to make bad decisions over. Where are you going with this? We bring her here, under our protection. Make her part of the household in a position your uncle can't touch. Governess, perhaps, or companion to me. Something respectable. Eleanor's voice was calm, calculating. Your uncle won't expect that. He'll think we're hiding her, being ashamed. Instead, we put her right in front of everyone. Make her visible and untouchable at the same time. Adrian stared at her. She'll never agree to that. Then convince her, because right now she's vulnerable and we need her safe if we're going to use your uncle's obsession with her against him. Eleanor picked up another document from the desk. I've been doing research. Your uncle has a pattern. He finds people's weaknesses and exploits them. The Heart Girl is yours. But the moment she's no longer a secret, the moment she's publicly acknowledged and protected, she stops being useful leverage. It was brilliant and manipulative and exactly the kind of thinking that made Eleanor dangerous. She told me she'd rather starve than come back here, Adrian said. Then you'll have to be very persuasive. Eleanor gathered her papers. We don't have much time. Your uncle wants an answer within the week. Adrian spent that night writing a letter to Lillian that he rewrote 7 times before finally sending. He didn't plead or apologize or make promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he laid out the situation clearly. His uncle's threats, Eleanor's plan, the protection they could offer if she was willing to accept it. He ended with a single line. I know I have no right to ask this, but I'm asking anyway. The response came 4 days later. I'll come. But not for you. For myself. Because I'm tired of running and I'm tired of being afraid. If your wife can offer me protection and a respectable position, I'll take it. But we're not going back to what we were. We can't. Make sure you understand that before I arrive. Adrian read the letter 3 times. Relief and regret tangled together in his chest. Eleanor, when he showed her, simply nodded. Good, she's smart. This will work better if she's thinking clearly rather than emotionally. She hates me now. Probably, but she's still coming. Eleanor made a note in her planning book. I'll set up rooms for her in the East Wing, close enough to be proper, far enough to avoid gossip. We'll announce her as my new companion, a respectable young woman from a good family fallen on hard times. Your uncle will know the truth, but he won't be able to use it against us without looking petty. What about the household staff? They know who she is. They know who she was. We'll be introducing someone new. Eleanor's smile was sharp. People see what they expect to see. If we present her as my equal, that's how she'll be treated. Mostly. Lillian arrived a week later. Adrian watched from the library window as her carriage pulled up to the main entrance. She stepped down wearing a dress he'd never seen before. Dark blue wool, well made, but not extravagant. The kind of thing a respectable companion might wear. Her hair was arranged differently, pulled back in a style that made her look older, more severe. When she looked up at the house, her expression was unreadable. Eleanor greeted her at the door with perfect courtesy, playing the role of gracious benefactor welcoming a new member of the household. Adrian stayed in the library, knowing his presence would only complicate things. He didn't see Lillian again for 3 days. When they finally crossed paths, it was in the entrance hall late at night. Adrian was returning from a meeting with his steward. Lillian was coming from the drawing room, carrying a book. They stopped, both frozen. "Miss Hart," Adrian said, using the formal address Eleanor had insisted on. "Your Grace." Her voice was polite, distant, nothing like the way she used to say his name. "Are your rooms acceptable?" "Very acceptable. Miss Voss has been most generous." The conversation was excruciating, all proper and bloodless, like talking to a stranger. Adrian wanted to scream or grab her, or do something to break through the careful walls she'd built. Instead, he nodded politely. "I'm glad. If you need anything, I'm well provided for, thank you." She walked past him, close enough that he could smell the soap she used, different now than it had been before. Everything about her was different, refined, reshaped to fit the new role she was playing. He watched her climb the stairs and disappear down the hallway, and felt the loss of her all over again. Eleanor found him still standing there 20 minutes later. "That went well." "Did it?" "She didn't slap you or cause a scene. In our current circumstances, that counts as well." Eleanor touched his arm briefly, an unusual gesture of sympathy. "Give her time. This is as hard for her as it is for you." "I doubt that." "Then you're a fool. She's living in the house of the man she loves, watching him be married to someone else, pretending to be something she's not for her own survival. If anything, she has it worse." Eleanor was right, she usually was. The next 2 months were a special kind of torture. Lillian integrated into the household with the same quiet competence she'd shown as a servant. She accompanied Eleanor on social calls, managed correspondence, and generally made herself useful in ways that justified her position. The staff accepted her after initial suspicion, helped by Mrs. Rotherham, who made it clear that Miss Hart was to be treated with respect. Adrian and Lillian maintained careful distance. They spoke when necessary, always formally, always with witnesses. At dinner parties, they barely acknowledged each other. When they passed in hallways, they nodded politely and kept walking. It was destroying him. "You're staring again," Marcus said one evening, following Adrian's gaze across the drawing room to where Lillian sat with Eleanor and several other ladies, discussing something that had them all laughing. "I wasn't staring." "You were absolutely staring. You're lucky your wife doesn't seem to care." Marcus took a drink. "Though I have to say, this whole arrangement is bizarre even by aristocratic standards. Your wife employing your former lover as her companion? It's like something from a novel. It's practical. It's insane. And if your uncle finds out, he already knows. That's the point." Adrian finally looked away from Lillian. "Eleanor thinks having her here, visible and protected, takes away his leverage." "Does it?" Adrian didn't have an answer for that. His uncle certainly seemed to think it did. He'd sent 2 more letters, each one more frustrated than the last. The first demanded to know what Adrian thought he was doing, harboring that woman under his own roof. The second threatened vague consequences if Adrian didn't immediately dismiss her. Adrian ignored both. Then, 6 weeks after Lillian's arrival, his uncle showed up in person. Lord Reginald Blackwood arrived unannounced on a Tuesday afternoon, sweeping into the house like he still owned it. Adrian was in his study when Mrs. Rotherham announced the visitor, her expression suggesting she'd tried to turn him away and failed. "Send him in," Adrian said. His uncle entered looking older than Adrian remembered, grayer, thinner, with a pinch quality around his mouth that suggested chronic anger, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. "Adrian, we need to talk." "About?" "Don't play games with me, boy. You know exactly what." His uncle closed the door. "The Hart girl. I want her out of this house immediately." "No! This isn't a negotiation. She's a liability, a walking scandal waiting to destroy everything I've worked to build." "You mean everything you've worked to steal?" Adrian stood, moving around the desk to face his uncle directly. "I know what you've been doing. The embezzling, the fraud, the manipulation, all of it." His uncle's expression didn't change. "I have no idea what you're talking about. The northern investments, the diverted funds, the kickbacks from the shipping contracts." Adrian ticked them off. "Should I continue? You're making wild accusations based on nothing. I have documentation. Eleanor and I have spent months going through every transaction, every contract, every shady deal you've made. It was a bluff. They didn't have enough proof yet, not really, but Adrian's uncle didn't need to know that. We know everything. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his uncle's face. Eleanor? My wife. You remember her? The woman you helped trap me into marrying so you could control her family's money. Adrian smiled without humor. Turns out she doesn't like being manipulated any more than I do. We've been working together. That's impossible. Eleanor would never... Eleanor is far more capable than you gave her credit for. Adrian moved closer. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop threatening Lillian. You're going to stop interfering in my household. And you're going to start transferring control of the estate finances back to me, slowly and quietly, so no one notices. His uncle laughed, but it sounded forced. And if I refuse? Then we expose everything. The fraud, the embezzlement, all of it. You'll be ruined, possibly imprisoned. You'd destroy the family name. You already did that. I'm just making sure you pay for it. They stared at each other. Adrian could see his uncle calculating, weighing options, looking for the angle he'd missed. You can't prove any of this, his uncle said finally. Actually, we can. Eleanor's voice came from the doorway. She stepped into the study holding a ledger Adrian recognized, his uncle's private accounts, the ones kept in his London house. Your secretary was quite helpful once I explained the alternative to cooperation. His uncle's face went white. That's theft. No, it's evidence. Eleanor set the ledger on the desk. Everything's here. Every fraudulent transaction, every diverted fund, every lie you've told to maintain control. She looked at him with cool disdain. You're finished, Lord Reginald. Adrian's uncle seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. He reached for the ledger, but Eleanor pulled it back. We're keeping this, she said. Insurance. What do you want? I already told you, Adrian said. Leave Lillian alone, transfer control back to me, disappear quietly. And if I do all that, you won't expose me? We'll keep your secrets. For now. Eleanor's smile was dangerous. But if you ever threaten any of us again, if you so much as breathe in our direction, we'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are. His uncle looked between them, seeing for the first time that he'd been outmaneuvered. You won't get away with this. We already have, Eleanor said. After he left, Adrian and Eleanor stood in silence for a long moment. That was risky, Adrian said finally. If he'd called our bluff, it wasn't a bluff. I really do have his ledger. Eleanor touched the book. I had Thomas Whitley steal it 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right moment to use it. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have wanted to move immediately. I needed to wait until we had more leverage. She looked at him. Your uncle will probably try something. He's cornered now, and cornered animals are dangerous. She was right. 2 days later, Lillian disappeared. Adrian found out when Eleanor burst into his study at breakfast, white-faced and furious. She's gone. Lillian's gone. What? She went out yesterday afternoon for a walk, never came back. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Mrs. Rotherham just told me. They've been searching all night. Adrian was already moving, shouting for his coat, his horse, Marcus, anyone who could help search. But even as he ran, he knew. His uncle had taken her. The note arrived an hour later, delivered by a street urchin who disappeared before anyone could question him. Adrian tore it open with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. You want the girl back? Come to the old mill outside Ashford. Alone. Tonight at midnight. Bring the ledger. Otherwise she'll be found in the river tomorrow morning, and everyone will assume she couldn't handle the shame of her position. Adrian read it twice, ice forming in his veins. Eleanor appeared at his shoulder. Let me see. He handed her the note, watched her face go hard as stone as she read. It's a trap, she said. I know. He'll kill you both. Probably. Adrian, I'm not letting her die because of my mistakes. He looked at Eleanor, this woman he'd married without loving, who'd somehow become his partner in ways he'd never expected. I have to go. Eleanor held his gaze for a long moment. Then she folded the note carefully and tucked it into her pocket. Then we'd better make sure you survive it. Marcus arrived within the hour, breathless and looking like he'd ridden hard. He found Adrian in the armory. loading a pistol with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Please tell me you're not actually planning to walk into this alone," Marcus said. "I don't have a choice. You always have a choice. This one just happens to be monumentally stupid." Marcus grabbed Adrian's arm. "Your uncle is going to kill you. You know that, right? The moment he has the ledger, you're a liability. He won't kill me if there are witnesses, which is why he specified you come alone." Marcus released him, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "Christ, Adrian, think this through." "I have thought it through. I go, I trade the ledger for Lillian, I get her out safely, then I deal with my uncle." "And how exactly do you plan to deal with him after you've given up your only leverage?" Adrian finished loading the pistol and tucked it into his coat. "I'm still working on that part." "Brilliant plan." Eleanor appeared in the doorway, changed into riding clothes that looked expensive but practical. Her hair was pinned back severely, and she carried a small leather case. "We don't have time to argue about whether this is a good idea. It's the only idea we have." "We?" Adrian looked at her. "You're not coming." "Of course I am. Someone needs to make sure you don't get yourself killed before we finish destroying your uncle's reputation." She set the case on the table and opened it, revealing, "Is that a pistol?" Marcus stared at the small but clearly deadly weapon nestled in velvet. "My father insisted I learn to shoot. He said a woman of means should be able to protect herself." Eleanor checked the weapon with the ease of long practice. "I thought it was paranoid at the time. Now I'm grateful." "Eleanor, this is dangerous." "Yes, I'm aware. I'm not an idiot." She looked at Adrian directly. "Your uncle took someone under my protection. That makes this my fight as much as yours." "She's right," Marcus said, though he looked pained to admit it. "If you're going to do this insane thing, you'll need backup. I'm coming too." He said, "Come alone." "And you will." "Technically." Eleanor closed the case. "We'll be nearby, hidden. If things go wrong, we intervene." Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to tell them both to stay safe, stay away, stay out of the disaster his life had become. But looking at Eleanor's determined expression and Marcus's stubborn set to his jaw, he knew they wouldn't listen. "Fine, but you stay back until I signal. No heroics," says the man walking into an obvious trap, Marcus muttered. They spent the afternoon planning. Eleanor produced a map of the area around Ashford, marking out positions where she and Marcus could hide with clear sightlines to the old mill. Adrian reviewed what little he knew about the building. Abandoned for years, structurally unsound in places. Multiple exits if things went badly. "Your uncle will have men with him," Eleanor said, marking potential positions on the map. "He won't risk a direct confrontation unless he has superior numbers." "How many?" "At least 3 or 4, possibly more." She tapped the map. "Which is why we need our own people. Marcus, can you get anyone else on short notice?" "I can get 2, maybe 3 men who know how to keep their mouths shut and handle themselves in a fight." Marcus frowned. "But we're still outnumbered. We don't need to win a battle. We just need to extract Lillian and survive long enough to expose what he's done." Eleanor looked at Adrian. "You're sure he'll have her there? He might have stashed her somewhere else, used this as a trap to get you alone." Adrian had considered that, rejected it. "He wants to see me broken. That means having Lillian there. He'll want to use her as leverage. Make me watch while he..." He couldn't finish that sentence. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "We'll get her back." "You can't promise that." "No, but I can promise we'll try." She gathered the maps. "Get some rest. We leave at 11. Adrian didn't rest. He spent the remaining hours going over every possible scenario, every way this could go wrong. Around 10, he found himself in the library, standing where he and Lillian used to meet, remembering the way she'd look up from whatever book she was reading and smile at him like he was worth something beyond his title. "She'll be all right." Adrian turned to find Mrs. Rotherham in the doorway. The old housekeeper rarely ventured into the family areas of the house after dark. "You don't know that," Adrian said. "No, but I know Miss Hart. She's stronger than people give her credit for." Mrs. Rotherham stepped into the room. She survived losing her parents, survived years of backbreaking work, survived loving you despite knowing it would destroy her. She'll survive this too. "If my uncle hurts her, then you'll make him pay for it, but standing here drowning in guilt won't help anyone." She moved to the desk, straightening papers that didn't need straightening. "I failed her once, you know. When your uncle's men came asking questions about where she'd gone, I should have lied, sent them in the wrong direction. Instead, I thought giving them the truth would make them leave her alone. This isn't your fault, isn't it? I'm the one who told them about Newcastle. Your uncle wouldn't have found her otherwise. Mrs. Rotherham's voice was heavy. We all make choices, Your Grace. Some of them haunt us. After she left, Adrian stood alone in the library until Eleanor came to get him. The ride to Ashford took 2 hours. They traveled in darkness, Marcus and his 2 men ranging ahead to scout the route. Eleanor rode beside Adrian, her pistol case secured to her saddle, her face set in grim determination. If this goes wrong, Adrian said at one point, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen to you. Eleanor, I mean it. We've come too far, worked too hard. You don't get to die before we've finished destroying your uncle. She glanced at him. Besides, I'm starting to enjoy being a duchess. I'd hate to have to train someone new. It was such a typically Eleanor thing to say that Adrian almost smiled. They reached the outskirts of Ashford just before midnight. Marcus's men had already scouted the mill and reported back, lights visible inside, at least 4 men stationed around the perimeter, movement on the 2nd floor. He's definitely there, Marcus said, keeping his voice low. And he brought company. Adrian dismounted, checking his pistol one more time. Eleanor stayed on her horse, scanning the area with sharp eyes. Remember the plan, she said. Get in, confirm Lillian's safe, stall as long as you can. We'll move in when you signal. What if I can't signal? Then we'll move in when we hear gunshots. Her smile was thin. Either way, we're not leaving you in there. Adrian nodded, handed his horse's reins to one of Marcus's men, and started walking toward the mill. The building loomed out of the darkness like a broken tooth. Half the roof had collapsed years ago, and the remaining structure tilted at an angle that suggested the next strong wind might finish the job. Light spilled from gaps in the walls and the empty window frames. Adrian was 10 feet from the door when it swung open. His uncle stood in the entrance, flanked by 2 large men who looked like they spent their time doing things respectable people didn't discuss. Behind them, deeper in the mill, Adrian could see Lillian tied to a chair, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with fury. She was alive. That was all that mattered. Adrian? Right on time. His uncle stepped aside. Come in. Let's talk like civilized people. Adrian walked into the mill, hyper-aware of the pistol pressed against his ribs, of the men watching him with dead eyes, of Lillian 20 feet away, trying to communicate something with her expression that he couldn't quite read. Let her go, Adrian said. Where's the ledger? Let her go first. His uncle laughed. You're not in a position to make demands, boy. The ledger. Now. Adrian pulled the book from his coat and held it up. Not offering it, just showing he had it. She walks out of here, then you get this. No. You give me the ledger, then I decide what happens to both of you. They stared at each other. Adrian could feel the situation spiraling, slipping away from anything resembling control. He needed more time, needed to get closer to Lillian, needed... He's lying, Lillian said suddenly. About the ledger. That's not the real one. Adrian's uncle turns to her, irritated. Quiet. He made copies, multiple copies. That's just one of them. Lillian's voice was steady despite her obvious fear. Eleanor has the real ones. Safe somewhere you'll never find them. It was a bluff. They only had the one ledger. But it was a good one. Adrian saw uncertainty flicker across his uncle's face. She's trying to protect you, his uncle said, turning back to Adrian. How touching. Give me the book. Even if I do, you won't let us leave. You can't afford to. True. But if you don't, she dies right now. His uncle pulled a pistol from his coat and aimed it at Lillian. So choose quickly. Adrian's mind raced through options. He could throw the ledger, rush his uncle, hope to reach him before he fired, but the other men would shoot him before he got 3 steps. He could try to negotiate, but his uncle was done talking. A gunshot shattered the night. But it didn't come from inside the mill. It came from outside, followed immediately by shouting and the sound of men running. His uncle spun toward the door, momentarily distracted. Adrian moved without thinking, throwing himself at the man holding the pistol. They went down hard, the gun skittering across the floor. One of the other guards lunged for Adrian, but there was another gunshot, this one definitely inside, and the man crumpled. Marcus burst through the door, his own pistol smoking. Get Lillian out! Adrian scrambled toward her, yanking at the ropes. They were tight, knotted expertly, and his hands were shaking too badly to work them loose. Lillian twisted in the chair trying to help. "Left side," she said. "There's a knot." Another gunshot. Adrian didn't look to see who'd fired. He focused on the rope, finally getting it loose enough to free one of Lillian's hands. She immediately went to work on the other bindings. "Behind you!" she shouted. Adrian turned to find his uncle climbing to his feet, retrieving his pistol, raising it with murder in his eyes. Adrian reached for his own weapon, but knew he wouldn't be fast enough. Then Eleanor was there, stepping between them, her small pistol aimed directly at Lord Reginald's chest. "Drop it," she said calmly. "You wouldn't dare." Eleanor fired. The shot went wide, intentionally, Adrian realized, hitting the wall 2 inches from his uncle's head, but the message was clear. "The next one won't miss," Eleanor said. "Now drop the weapon or I'll put a bullet somewhere you'll regret." Adrian's uncle lowered the pistol slowly, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. "You've destroyed everything, both of you. When people find out about this, they already know." The new voice came from the doorway. Adrian turned to see Lord Ashford entering, followed by 2 other lords whose names Adrian couldn't immediately remember. All 3 looked grim. "Reginald." Ashford's voice was heavy with disappointment. "We need to talk." Adrian's uncle stared at the newcomers like they were ghosts. "What are you doing here?" "Being witnesses." Ashford gestured to the mill, the tied-up woman, the scattered weapons. "Eleanor sent word this afternoon. Told us you'd kidnapped Miss Hart, planned to kill your nephew, all to cover up years of embezzlement and fraud." He shook his head. "I didn't want to believe it, but here we are. This is a setup, is it? Because it looks to me like we arrived just in time to prevent a murder." Ashford's expression hardened. "You've gone too far this time, Reginald. Too far for any of us to ignore." Adrian finally got Lillian's last rope untied. She stood shakily, and he immediately moved to support her. She leaned into him for just a moment before pulling back, maintaining the careful distance they'd established. "Are you hurt?" Adrian asked quietly. "Bruised, scared, furious." She looked at him. "But alive." Marcus appeared at Adrian's elbow, breathing hard. "We got 3 of his men. The 4th ran. Should we—" "Let him run," Eleanor said, still holding her pistol on Adrian's uncle. "We have what we need." Lord Ashford approached Lord Reginald carefully, like approaching a wounded animal. "You'll come with us quietly. We'll arrange a private meeting to discuss the irregularities in your accounts. If you cooperate, perhaps this can be handled without public scandal." "And if I refuse?" "Then Eleanor releases those ledgers to every lord in England, and you'll be ruined publicly instead of privately." Ashford's voice left no room for negotiation. "Your choice." For a long moment, Adrian thought his uncle might actually refuse, might choose public destruction over quiet disgrace. But finally, something in him broke. His shoulders sagged, the pistol dropped from his hand, and he looked at Adrian with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes," Adrian replied, "it is." Ashford's men escorted Lord Reginald out of the mill. The other lords followed, already discussing how to handle the situation with minimal scandal. Marcus went to check on his own men, leaving Adrian, Eleanor, and Lillian standing in the wreckage of the confrontation. Eleanor finally lowered her pistol. "Well, that went better than expected." "You shot at him," Adrian said. "I missed on purpose, mostly." She tucked the weapon away. "But he needed to understand I was serious." "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "I told you. My father insisted." Eleanor looked at Lillian, really looked at her for the first time since they'd arrived. "Are you all right, Miss Hart?" "I've been better." Lillian's voice was shaky now that the immediate danger had passed. "Thank you for coming, for all of it." "Thank Adrian. This was his insane plan. It was your execution that made it work." Adrian met Eleanor's eyes. "You saved us both." Something passed between them, not affection exactly, but understanding, respect. The acknowledgement that they'd become partners in something neither of them had chosen, but both had committed to. "We should get out of here," Eleanor said, "before more of Reginald's men show up, or the local authorities start asking questions." They rode back to Blackwood House in silence, exhaustion settling over all of them like a heavy blanket. Lillian rode with one of Marcus's men, not trusting herself to stay upright in her own saddle. Adrian kept looking over to make sure she was still there, still safe. Dawn was breaking by the time they arrived. The house was blazing with lights. Mrs. Rotherham must have kept the entire staff awake waiting for news. She met them at the door, took one look at Lillian's bruised wrists and pale face, and immediately began issuing orders for hot water, clean clothes, and medical supplies. "I'm fine," Lillian protested weakly. "You're not fine. You've been kidnapped and terrorized." Mrs. Rotherham steered her toward the stairs. "You're going to let me take care of you, and you're not going to argue." Lillian glanced back at Adrian once before disappearing up the stairs. Her expression was complicated, grateful, exhausted, and something else he couldn't name. Eleanor touched Adrian's arm briefly. "You should sleep." "So should you." "I will, after I write to my father explaining why his business partner just got arrested for fraud and attempted murder." She smiled tiredly. "This is going to be a very difficult letter." Marcus had already collapsed in one of the drawing room chairs, his eyes closed, but clearly not asleep. "Next time you decide to take on a corrupt lord who's been embezzling for years, could you maybe give me more notice? I'd like to prepare properly." "There won't be a next time," Adrian said. "Thank God for that." Adrian left them both there and climbed the stairs to his own rooms. He should have been exhausted. He'd been awake for nearly 24 hours and had just survived what should have been a fatal confrontation. But his mind wouldn't stop racing, replaying every moment of the night. His uncle's face when he realized he'd lost. Eleanor standing between Adrian and a loaded pistol. Lillian's voice steady and strong, even tied to a chair with death hovering nearby. He was still awake when the sun fully rose, painting his bedroom in shades of gold and pink. Somewhere in the house, Lillian was recovering from her ordeal. Eleanor was writing her difficult letter. Marcus was probably actually asleep by now. Mrs. Rotherham was managing the household with her usual efficiency. The staff was going about their morning routines. Everything was different. Everything was exactly the same. Adrian finally allowed himself to sleep. The next week passed in a blur of meetings and negotiations. Lord Ashford and the other witnesses arranged a private tribunal to review the evidence against Lord Reginald. The ledger, combined with testimony from Thomas Whitley and several other associates who'd been quietly convinced to cooperate, painted a damning picture. Lord Reginald had been embezzling from the Blackwood estate for over a decade. The money he'd claimed was being invested in improvements or held in trust had actually been funneled into his personal accounts. He'd covered his tracks by manipulating contracts, falsifying records, and intimidating anyone who asked too many questions. The total amount stolen was staggering. "Enough to have saved the estate twice over," Eleanor said, reviewing the final accounting. "If he'd just done his job honestly instead of stealing, you never would have needed the Voss fortune." Adrian stared at the numbers, feeling sick. All of this, the marriage, the manipulation, everything, it was unnecessary. We could have been fine. We couldn't have known that without investigating, and we couldn't investigate until after we were married. Eleanor closed the ledger. "Don't torture yourself with what might have been. Focus on what is." What was? Lord Reginald, stripped of his titles and influence, quietly exiled to a remote property in Scotland where he could live out his days in obscure disgrace. His co-conspirators similarly dealt with, some through legal channels, others through social pressure. The stolen money gradually being recovered and returned to the estate. And Adrian, finally, actually in control of his own duchy. The tribunal's findings were kept private. Ashford and the others agreed that a public scandal would hurt too many innocent people. But word spread anyway, the way these things always did. Whispers in drawing rooms, careful conversations at dinner parties, knowing looks exchanged between lords who understood what had really happened. Adrian's reputation shifted. Where before he'd been seen as a struggling duke barely holding on to his inheritance, now he was the man who'd exposed corruption at the highest levels, who'd risked everything to protect someone under his care, who'd outmaneuvered a man with twice his experience and 3 times his resources. People started looking at him differently. Eleanor noticed it first. "They're reassessing you," she said one evening after a dinner party where Adrian had spent 2 hours fielding questions about estate management and investment strategies, deciding you might actually be competent instead of just lucky. "I am lucky. I had you. True. But you're also smarter than you give yourself credit for." She sipped her wine. "You built a case against your uncle while he was actively trying to destroy you. You protected Lillian when it would have been easier to abandon her. You've made difficult choices and lived with the consequences. That takes more than luck. Adrian didn't know what to say to that. Praise from Eleanor was rare and usually came with qualifications. This seemed genuine. "Thank you," he said finally, "for everything. I couldn't have done this without you." "I know. You're welcome." She set down her glass. "But now we need to talk about what happens next." "With the estate?" "With Miss Hart." Adrian had been avoiding thinking about Lillian. She'd recovered physically from her ordeal. The bruises had faded. The fear had receded. But emotionally, she was still distant, still maintaining the careful walls between them. They'd barely spoken since the night at the mill. "What about her?" Adrian asked. "She can't stay here indefinitely. People are already starting to talk." Eleanor's voice was matter of fact. "The official story is that she's my companion, hired to help with correspondence and social obligations. But we both know the real reason she's here, and the longer she stays, the more obvious that becomes. Where else can she go? My uncle might be exiled, but his reputation still has power. If she leaves our protection, she won't have to." Eleanor pulled out a letter. "I've been in contact with my cousin in London. She runs a school for young women, teaching practical skills, preparing them for respectable positions. She's offered Lillian a job as an instructor." Adrian's chest tightened. "You want to send her away?" "I want to give her options. She can stay here if she chooses, continue as my companion, but she should know there are other possibilities." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "She deserves a life that's hers, Adrian, not just a role she's playing to stay safe." She was right. Adrian knew she was right. But the thought of Lillian leaving again, this time for good, made something in him revolt. "Does she know about the offer?" he asked. "Not yet. I wanted to discuss it with you first." Eleanor stood. "I'll tell her tomorrow. What she does with the information is up to her." After Eleanor left, Adrian sat alone in the library, their library, his and Lillian's, even though she barely came here anymore, and tried to imagine what he would do if she chose to leave. Let her go, probably. That would be the right thing. The honorable thing. He was so tired of doing the right thing. The next day, Lillian requested a meeting. Adrian found her in the garden, standing by the fountain that had frozen over during the recent cold snap. She was wearing one of the dresses Eleanor had commissioned for her, deep green wool that brought out the color in her eyes, and her hair was arranged in the sophisticated style she'd adopted since becoming a companion. She looked beautiful and completely out of reach. "Eleanor told me about the school," she said without preamble. "And I'm considering it." She turned to face him. "It's a good opportunity. Respectable work, decent pay, a chance to actually help people instead of just existing." "You're more than just existing here." "Am I? Because it feels like I'm playing a role, pretending to be something I'm not, so I can stay close to something I can't have." Her voice was steady but sad. "I can't keep doing this, Adrian. Living in your house, seeing you every day, watching you with Eleanor. It's killing me. What if there was another option?" "There isn't." "What if Eleanor and I—" He stopped, realizing he hadn't actually discussed this with Eleanor, but he pressed forward anyway. "What if we could find a way for you to stay without the pretense? Some arrangement that would be acceptable to society but allow you to— To what? Be your mistress officially instead of unofficially?" Lillian's laugh was bitter. "That's not better, Adrian. That's worse." "I didn't mean— I know what you meant, and I appreciate that you're trying to find a solution that lets everyone get what they want. But there isn't one." She moved closer. "You have a wife, a life, responsibilities that don't include me, and I need to build something for myself that isn't dependent on proximity to you." Adrian wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that they could make it work somehow. But looking at her face, at the resolution there, the quiet determination, he knew she'd already made her decision. "When would you leave?" he asked. "Next week. Eleanor's arranging the details." A week? 7 more days of seeing her in the hallways, across the dinner table, in the spaces where they used to be happy. Then nothing. "I'll miss you," Adrian said, and immediately felt stupid for saying something so inadequate. "I'll miss you too." Lillian stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. "But missing you from London is better than loving you from across the dinner table. At least in London, I might eventually heal." She left him standing by the frozen fountain, and Adrian realized that winning against his uncle hadn't actually solved anything. He'd fought so hard to protect Lillian, to keep her safe, to make sure she had options and security and a future. And all of it was leading to her walking away. The universe, he decided, had a cruel sense of irony. 5 days later, Marcus arrived with unexpected news. "Your uncle's dead," he said without ceremony. Adrian looked up from the estate reports he'd been reviewing. "What?" "Heart failure, apparently. The doctors say it was sudden. He was in his room at the Scotland property, just stopped breathing." Marcus threw himself into a chair. "Convenient timing, considering. You think someone—" "I think he was an old man who'd just lost everything that mattered to him. Sometimes that's enough." Marcus studied Adrian. "Are you all right?" Adrian didn't know how to answer that. Relief that the threat was permanently neutralized. Guilt that part of him was glad his uncle was gone. Exhaustion from months of fighting and scheming and pretending. "I don't know," he said finally. "Should I be?" There's no should when family dies. Even family that tried to destroy you. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "He was a bastard, but he raised you after your father died. That has to count for something. He raised me to be useful, to be controllable." Adrian set aside the reports. "I'm not going to pretend to mourn him." "Fair enough." The funeral was small and private. Adrian attended because it was expected, stood in the cold while a priest said words about redemption and rest, and felt absolutely nothing. Eleanor stood beside him, appropriately somber in black mourning clothes that probably cost more than the average person's annual income. Lillian didn't attend. She'd already left for London 2 days earlier. After the funeral, after the obligatory gathering where people who'd barely known his uncle offered hollow condolences, Adrian found Eleanor in the library. "He's really gone," Eleanor said, not looking up from the book she was reading. "Yes." "And Lillian's really gone." "Yes, so we won." She finally looked at him. "We destroyed your uncle's network, recovered most of the stolen money, secured your position. By any objective measure, this is a victory." "Then why does it feel like we lost?" Eleanor closed her book. "Because winning and being happy aren't the same thing. We did what we set out to do. We protected ourselves and each other. We made sure justice was served, but none of that changes the fact that you love someone you can't have, and I'm married to someone who doesn't love me." "Eleanor, it's fine. I knew what this marriage was when I agreed to it." She stood, smoothing her skirts. "But I think we've earned the right to stop pretending with each other, at least. Don't you?" Adrian met her eyes. This woman who'd saved his life, who'd fought beside him, who'd proven herself more loyal than he had any right to expect. "What do you want from this marriage? Honestly? Partnership? Respect? Maybe eventually friendship?" She paused. "I'm not asking for love, but I'd like to stop feeling like we're enemies forced to inhabit the same space." "We're not enemies." "Then what are we?" Adrian thought about that, about months of working together, of shared goals and mutual trust earned through adversity, about the way Eleanor had stood between him and a loaded pistol without hesitation. "Allies," he said finally. "Partners, like you said. People who chose to make the best of an impossible situation." Eleanor smiled, and for once it reached her eyes. "I can work with that." She left him alone in the library. Adrian stood there for a long time, looking at the shelves of books, the desk where he and Lillian used to leave each other notes, the window where she'd stood watching the rain that night. Everything changed. He'd won. The estate was secure, his uncle was gone, the financial crisis was over. He had everything he was supposed to want. Everything except the one thing that mattered. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from London. Adrian recognized Lillian's handwriting immediately. He took it to the library to read, some superstitious part of him insisting it had to be there. The letter was short. "Adrian, I'm settling in here. The school is good. The work is hard but meaningful. Eleanor's cousin is kind, and I've made friends among the other instructors. I'm not writing to tell you I'm happy, because that would be a lie. But I'm surviving, building something, becoming someone who doesn't need protection or rescue. Your uncle's death wasn't your fault. I know you well enough to know you're probably feeling guilty about that too." "Stop it. He made his choices. You made yours. Neither of you owed the other anything by the end." I heard about the tribunal's final report, about how much money was recovered, how you've started reinvesting in the estate. I'm proud of you. You've become the Duke you were supposed to be, the one who cares more about his people than his position. I don't know if we'll see each other again. Part of me hopes we will. Part of me knows it would be easier if we don't. Either way, I want you to know, loving you wasn't a mistake. It was the realest thing I've ever felt, even if it hurt. Especially because it hurt. That kind of love, the kind that changes you, that makes you better than you were, that's not something to regret. Be well, Adrian. Be happy if you can manage it, and don't spend the rest of your life looking backward. Always, L. Adrian read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in his desk drawer, next to the first letter she'd ever written him. Then he did something he hadn't allowed himself to do in months. He cried. Not for what he'd lost, though that was part of it, but for what they'd both survived, for the impossible choices they'd both made, for the fact that love sometimes wasn't enough, but still mattered anyway. When Eleanor found him an hour later, eyes red and face blotchy, she didn't ask what had happened. She just sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited until he was ready to talk. "She's doing well," Adrian said eventually. "In London. At the school." "I know. My cousin sends updates." Eleanor's voice was gentle. "She's an excellent teacher, apparently. The students adore her." "Of course they do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Outside, spring was starting to show itself. Early flowers pushing through the last of the snow, birds returning from wherever they'd spent the winter. "We're having a dinner party next month," Eleanor said eventually. "Several important families. Good opportunity to demonstrate the estate's renewed stability." "All right. I'll need help with the guest list and the seating arrangements. You're better at knowing who hates whom." "I can do that." Another pause, then Eleanor said quietly, "It does get easier, you know, the missing. Eventually." Adrian looked at her. "Does it?" "I don't know, but that's what people say. Might as well believe them until proven otherwise." It wasn't much comfort, but it was something. That night, Adrian wrote a response to Lillian's letter. He rewrote it 4 times before settling on something that felt honest without being pathetic. L. I'm glad you're well. Glad you're building something for yourself. You deserve every good thing this world can offer, and I hope you get all of them. I won't promise to stop looking backward. That seems impossible. But I'll try to look forward too. To build something worth having, even if it's not what I wanted. Thank you for the letter. For everything, really. You saved me in more ways than you know. Be happy, please, even if I can't be. A. He sealed it and sent it before he could change his mind. Lillian's response came 2 weeks later. Just 3 words. I'll try too. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough to let him breathe again. Spring turned to summer, and Adrian threw himself into rebuilding the estate with the same intensity he'd once used to survive his uncle's manipulations. The recovered funds allowed him to finally implement the improvements he'd been planning for years. New equipment for the tenant farms, repairs to workers' housing, a proper school for the children in the nearby village. Every decision was made carefully, transparently, with input from the people who'd actually be affected. People noticed. You're becoming popular, Marcus observed one afternoon, watching Adrian review plans for a new irrigation system with his land steward. The tenants actually like you now. It's unsettling. They like having roofs that don't leak and fields that drain properly. That's not the same thing as liking me. It's close enough. Marcus sprawled in a chair, legs stretched out. You're also being invited to things. Real things. Not just the obligatory social torture. That was true. Since his uncle's downfall, Adrian had received invitations to hunting parties, investment dinners, even a few private gatherings where actual work got discussed instead of meaningless pleasantries. People wanted his opinion on estate management, agricultural innovation, financial reform. It felt strange. Good, but strange. Eleanor was thriving too. She'd taken her role as Duchess and reshaped it into something that actually mattered, organizing relief efforts for struggling tenant families, establishing a lending library in the village, using her family's connections to secure better prices for the estate's wool and grain. She did it all with the same calculated precision she'd once used to survive high society, except now it was directed toward actually helping people. They'd settled into an odd but functional partnership. Separate bedrooms, separate interests, but unified when it mattered. They took breakfast together most mornings, discussed estate business over dinner, presented a united front at social functions. It wasn't love, but it was something like respect, maybe even friendship. "You look different," Marcus said, interrupting Adrian's thoughts. "Different how?" "Less like you're waiting to die." Marcus grinned. "It's an improvement." Adrian threw a ledger at him. The letters from Lillian continued sporadically, one every few weeks, never more than a page, carefully neutral in tone. She wrote about her students, about London, about small moments that made her laugh or think. Adrian responded in kind, keeping his own letters brief and impersonal. It hurt less than he expected. Or maybe he'd just gotten better at living with the ache. 6 months after Lillian left, Eleanor proposed something unexpected. "I want to endow a scholarship," she said over breakfast, "for young women from working families. Pay for their education, help them find respectable positions afterward." Adrian looked up from his correspondence. "That's ambitious." "I have ambitious money, might as well use it for something worthwhile." Eleanor buttered her toast with precise movements. "I was thinking we could partner with that school in London, the one where Miss Hart teaches." Adrian's hand stilled on his teacup. "Eleanor, it's a good school with an established reputation. And before you accuse me of ulterior motives, this is purely practical. They already have the infrastructure. We'd just be providing funding." She met his eyes. "Though if you'd rather I chose a different institution, I can do that." Adrian considered. The rational part of him knew Eleanor was right. It was a sound investment, a way to help people who actually needed it. The emotional part of him recognized this for what it was. Eleanor offering him a connection to Lillian that didn't violate any of the careful boundaries they'd all established. "The London school is fine," he said finally. "Let's do it." Eleanor's smile was small but genuine. "I'll write to my cousin today." The scholarship was announced a month later. The response was overwhelming, dozens of applications from families who couldn't afford proper education for their daughters but desperately wanted better futures for them. Eleanor reviewed each one personally, making notes, asking questions, genuinely invested in choosing the right candidates. "This one," she said one evening, sliding a letter across the desk to Adrian. "Mary Thompson, 15 years old, worked as a scullery maid since she was 9. Her handwriting is rough, but her letter is thoughtful. She wants to learn teaching so she can help other girls like herself." Adrian read the letter. The girl's determination came through despite the crude script and occasional spelling errors. "She reminds me of someone." "I thought so too." Eleanor made a mark on her list. "She's in." They selected 12 girls for the first year. Eleanor insisted on meeting each family personally, explaining the terms, making sure they understood this wasn't charity, but investment. She returned from those visits exhausted but energized in a way Adrian had never seen before. "This matters," she said simply, when he asked why she was working so hard. "Most of what we do is performance and politics. This actually changes lives." The scholarship program launched in September. Eleanor traveled to London for the opening ceremony, and Adrian went with her, partially to support the initiative, partially because he couldn't quite help himself. The school was in a respectable but modest neighborhood, a converted townhouse with classrooms on the lower floors and dormitories above. Eleanor's cousin, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, met them at the entrance, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran the institution with competent authority. "Your Grace, Miss Voss. Welcome." She still called Eleanor by her maiden name, a small rebellion against the formality of titles. The girls are gathered in the main classroom. They're nervous and excited in equal measure. "As they should be," Eleanor said. "This is an opportunity most of them never thought they'd have." Mrs. Hartwell led them through corridors lined with bookcases and botanical prints. Adrian could hear voices from ahead, young women reciting something in unison, probably a lesson. The sound reminded him painfully of the library at Blackwood House, of Lillian reading aloud while she worked. Then they turned a corner, and there she was. Lillian stood at the front of a classroom, chalk in hand, explaining something about grammar to a dozen attentive students. She'd changed. Her hair was shorter, cut to a more practical length, and she wore a simple gray dress that marked her as an instructor rather than a servant. But her voice was the same, patient and clear, and when one of the students asked a question, her face lit up with that expression Adrian remembered so well. She hadn't seen them yet. Eleanor and Mrs. Hartwell continued down the hallway, but Adrian stopped, frozen in the doorway. One of Lillian's students noticed him and whispered to her neighbor, The whisper spread, and suddenly all dozen girls were staring at the Duke of Blackwood standing in their classroom doorway like an idiot. Lillian turned. Her eyes met his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Adrian saw surprise flash across her face, followed by something more complicated. Old hurt and current wariness, and underneath it all, the ghost of what they'd been to each other. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady, "we weren't expecting you." "I came with my wife for the scholarship announcement." "Of course." She set down her chalk, wiped her hands on her skirt. "Girls, we'll continue this lesson tomorrow. Please review chapters 3 and 4 tonight." The students gathered their things and filed out, whispering excitedly about the Duke's unexpected appearance. When the last one left, Lillian closed the door. "You look well," Adrian said, because he had to say something. "So do you." She crossed her arms, not quite defensive, but definitely guarded. "The estate's recovery is being talked about. Even here in London, people are impressed. Eleanor deserves most of the credit." "I doubt that's true, but it's generous of you to say." Lillian moved to straighten the desks, needing something to do with her hands. "The scholarship program is incredible. We've already had 3 additional families inquire about next year. I'm glad it's helping." They were being so carefully polite it was excruciating. "Adrian?" Lillian stopped pretending to organize things and looked at him directly. "Why are you really here?" "I told you, the announcement, Eleanor could have done that alone. You didn't need to come." Her voice softened slightly. "So why did you?" Adrian had asked himself that same question a dozen times during the journey to London. He told himself it was about supporting Eleanor's initiative, about seeing the program's impact firsthand, about any number of rational reasons that had nothing to do with the woman standing in front of him. All of it was a lie. "I wanted to see you," he admitted. "I know I shouldn't. I know we agreed to move forward separately, but He stopped, trying to find words that wouldn't make everything worse. "I wanted to see that you were actually happy. Not just surviving, but happy." Lillian's expression cracked slightly. "And am I happy?" "I don't know." "Are you?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "Sometimes, when I'm teaching and a student finally understands something they've been struggling with. When Mrs. Hartwell praises my lesson plans. When I'm having tea with the other instructors and laughing about something stupid." She paused. "And sometimes I'm miserable. When I wake up at 3 in the morning and remember everything we lost. When I see a couple in the park who actually get to be together. When I get your letters and have to remind myself why responding is a bad idea." "You don't respond because it's a bad idea?" "I don't respond because it's the only way I can heal." Her voice broke slightly. "Loving you nearly destroyed me, Adrian. I had to build myself back up from nothing. I can't risk that again." "I'm not asking you to risk anything. He stopped, realizing he didn't actually know what he was asking for. Permission to still care? Forgiveness for the choices he'd made? Some impossible future where everything worked out? "You should go," Lillian said quietly. "Eleanor will be looking for you." She was right. He should go, should walk away, let her continue building her life, stop reopening wounds that were trying to heal. Instead, he said, "I miss you, every day. I know that's selfish to say, but it's true." Lillian's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I miss you too. But missing each other doesn't change anything." "Doesn't it?" "No, you have a life, I have a life. They're separate lives, and that's how they need to stay." Adrian nodded, throat tight. "Okay." He turned to leave, hand on the doorknob, when Lillian's voice stopped him. "Adrian? Thank you. For the scholarship. For thinking of girls like me who never had a chance." A pause. "You're becoming a good man. The kind I always knew you could be." He left without responding, afraid of what he might say if he opened his mouth. Eleanor was waiting in the entrance hall, talking with Mrs. Hartwell about administrative details. She looked up when Adrian approached, and something in his face must have shown because her expression shifted to concern. "Ready to go?" she asked simply. "Yes." They made their excuses and left. The carriage ride back to their lodgings was silent. Eleanor didn't ask what had happened, and Adrian didn't volunteer. They'd gotten good at respecting each other's private hurts. That night, Adrian couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of their rented townhouse, looking out at London's gas-lit streets, thinking about all the different kinds of prisons people built for themselves. A knock at his door. Eleanor entered without waiting for permission, wrapped in an expensive dressing gown and carrying 2 glasses of brandy. "You're brooding," she said, handing him a glass. "I'm thinking." "Same thing, in your case." She took a sip of her own drink. "You saw her." "Yes." "And?" "And she's exactly what she said in her letters. Building a life, moving forward." Adrian stared into his glass. "She's doing everything right. But I'm still in love with her." The words came out raw. "I thought distance would fix that. Time. Throwing myself into work. All the things people say help you get over someone, and none of it's working." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then, "What if you didn't have to get over her?" Adrian looked at her sharply. "What? What if there was a way for you to actually be with her, properly, without scandal or secrets or any of the things that destroyed you both before?" Eleanor set down her glass. "I've been thinking about this. A lot, actually." "Eleanor, we're married. There's no way. There's divorce." The word hung in the air like smoke. "That's insane," Adrian said. "The scandal would destroy both of us. Your family would never forgive you. Society would gossip for 6 months and then move on to the next scandal. They always do." Eleanor's voice was calm, certain. "And my family might be angry initially, but they'd recover, especially if we structured it correctly. Incompatibility, mutual decision, generous settlement." "You'd give up being a duchess?" "I'd give up a title I never particularly wanted in exchange for freedom I've never had." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I've been thinking about going back to school. Law, maybe. Or political economy. Things I was never allowed to study before because they weren't appropriate for a woman of my station." Adrian stared at her. "You've really thought this through. I've had 6 months to think about it. 6 months of watching you try to be happy and fail. 6 months of living a life that's comfortable but hollow." Eleanor moved to stand beside him at the window. "We did what we had to do, Adrian. We survived. We protected each other. We even accomplished some good. But we were never meant to be married, and staying that way is just prolonging a mistake. What about the money? The estate is stable now. You've proven you can manage it competently. And the settlement I'd negotiate would include provisions for continued support during the transition." She looked at him. "I've already spoken to my father, informally. He wasn't thrilled, but he understands. The marriage served its purpose. Now it's time to let both of us move on." Adrian felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in months. Hope. "If we did this," he said slowly, "if we actually went through with it, people would talk. They'd assume the worst about all of us." "Probably, but people already talk. At least this way they'd be talking about something real instead of making up scandals that don't exist." Eleanor touched his arm briefly. "I can't promise this would work. Lillian might refuse you anyway. She's built a life she's proud of, and she might not want to risk it again. But at least you'd have the chance to ask." "Why are you doing this?" "Because we're friends now. Actually friends, not just allies." Eleanor's smile was sad and genuine. And friends want each other to be happy, even when it's complicated. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. 8 months of carefully worded legal documents, negotiated settlements, and strategic meetings with both families. Eleanor's father was furious initially, but Eleanor handled him with the same competent manipulation she'd once used against Adrian's uncle. By the end, he'd convinced himself the divorce was his idea, a practical dissolution of an arrangement that had outlived its usefulness. The scandal was exactly as bad as expected. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood's shocking separation. Society matrons whispered about incompatibility, about secret affairs, about a dozen different theories that were all wrong in different ways. Adrian and Eleanor weathered it by presenting a united front. They released a joint statement citing irreconcilable differences and mutual respect. They appeared together at several public functions during the process, demonstrating they weren't enemies. They made it clear this was a rational decision between 2 adults, not a dramatic rupture. Most people didn't believe them. Adrian didn't care. The hardest part was telling Lillian. He wrote to her 3 times, trying to explain what was happening without making it sound like he expected anything from her. Each letter was worse than the last. Too defensive, too presumptuous, too desperate. Finally, he gave up on writing and just went to London. Mrs. Hartwell looked surprised to see him. "Your Grace, we weren't expecting a visit." "Is Miss Hart available?" "She's teaching right now, but I'll wait." He waited in the entrance hall for 45 minutes, listening to the sounds of the school around him. Girls reciting lessons, instructors offering corrections, the ordinary rhythm of education happening. When Lillian finally emerged from her classroom, she stopped short at seeing him. "Adrian, what are you doing here? Can we talk, privately?" She led him to a small office, clearly hers based on the lesson plans scattered across the desk and the stack of books in the corner. When she closed the door, the sounds of the school faded to a distant murmur. "I'm getting divorced," Adrian said without preamble. Lillian sank into her chair. "What?" "Eleanor and I, we're dissolving the marriage. It should be final in about 2 months." He stayed standing, too nervous to sit. "It's mutual. Amicable. She's getting a generous settlement and her freedom. He stopped. "I'm getting the chance to ask you something I should have asked a year ago." "Adrian, let me finish. Please." He took a breath. "I love you. I never stopped loving you. And I know I have no right to ask this after everything that happened, after all the choices I made that hurt you. But I'm asking anyway." He finally looked at her directly. "When the divorce is final, when I'm actually free to make my own choices, could there be a future for us? Not the same as before. I'm not asking you to give up what you've built here, but something new, something we choose together instead of having chosen for us." Lillian was very still. "You're asking me to wait for you. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consider the possibility. Once the divorce is done, once the scandal dies down," his voice cracked, "I'm asking if there's any chance you still love me enough to try." "Of course I still love you." The words came out sharp, almost angry. "I've been trying to stop loving you for 8 months, and it hasn't worked. But loving you and being with you are different things, Adrian. One nearly destroyed me already." "I know. Do you? Because you're standing here asking me to risk everything again, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to survive losing you twice." She stood pacing the small office. "I have a life here. Students who depend on me, friends, purpose, security, all things I built myself without anyone's help. I'm not asking you to give any of that up, aren't you? Because the moment we're publicly together, everything changes. I stop being Lillian Hart, respected instructor. I become Lillian Hart, the servant who seduced a duke, the woman who broke up a marriage." She turned to face him. "That's what people will say. You know it's true." Adrian had thought about this, spent sleepless nights worrying about exactly this. What if we left? Both of us. Started somewhere new where nobody knows our history. Run away, you mean? Start over. There's the difference. Lillian laughed, but it sounded more like a sob. "You tried to tell me that before, that we could run. And you were right then. We couldn't. You had responsibilities, people who depended on you. Has that changed?" "The estate is stable. I have good stewards, competent people who can manage things. I could step back, let them handle day-to-day operations while He stopped, realizing how desperate he sounded. "I'm willing to give it all up. The title, the estate, everything, if that's what it takes to be with you." "That's exactly what terrifies me." Lillian's voice was quiet now. "Because what happens in 5 years when you resent me for making you give up your entire life? When you wake up and realize you traded everything for a woman who was never worth it? You are worth it. You can't know that. Not really." She sat down again, suddenly looking exhausted. "I need time to think about this. Real time, not a decision made in the moment. The divorce will be final in 2 months. That's time. And then what? You show up here expecting an answer?" "No, I show up hoping for one." Adrian moved closer. "I'm not trying to pressure you. I'm trying to be honest about what I want, what I've always wanted. But if you tell me no, if you say you're better off without me, I'll accept that. I'll walk away and never bother you again." Lillian looked at him for a long moment. "I can't promise anything. I'm not asking you to. 2 months then. We'll talk when the divorce is final." It wasn't a yes, But it wasn't a no either. Adrian left London the next day and threw himself back into work. But something had shifted. The hopelessness that had characterized the past year was gone, replaced by anxious anticipation. He swung between certainty that Lillian would say yes and terror that she'd say no. Eleanor noticed. "You're making yourself sick with worry." "I'm fine." "You're not sleeping. You're not eating. You've reviewed the same contract 3 times without actually reading it." She took the papers from his hands. "Whatever she decides, torturing yourself won't change it." "I know." "Do you?" Eleanor's voice was gentler than usual. "Because it seems like you're trying to preemptively punish yourself for daring to want something." Maybe she was right. Adrian had spent so long denying himself anything beyond duty and responsibility that actually reaching for happiness felt transgressive. The divorce was finalized on a gray Tuesday in March. No ceremony, no drama, just signatures on legal documents and a brief meeting with lawyers to confirm everything was in order. Eleanor met him afterward for tea, something they'd agreed to do to demonstrate continued mutual respect. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Terrified? Relieved? Uncertain?" Adrian stirred sugar into his tea without drinking it. "Free, maybe. Though I'm not sure I know what to do with that." "You could start by actually going after what you want instead of just hoping it comes to you." Eleanor's smile was knowing. "When are you going to London?" "Tomorrow." "Good. Don't wait. Waiting is how people talk themselves out of brave choices." They finished their tea and parted as friends, genuinely, surprisingly friends. Eleanor was staying in London temporarily while she enrolled in a program studying law and political economy, something no respectable woman was supposed to do. She looked happier than Adrian had ever seen her. Adrian traveled to London the next morning, his stomach in knots the entire journey. He'd prepared a speech, rehearsed what he wanted to say, imagined a dozen different scenarios. All of it evaporated when he actually stood outside the school. Mrs. Hartwell answered the door herself. "Your Grace." "Oh, I suppose it's not Your Grace anymore, is it? The divorce was finalized?" "Yesterday." "Well then, Mr. Blackwood." She smiled. "Miss Hart is in the garden with some students. I'll fetch her. Actually, could I—" Adrian gestured toward the garden. "Of course, through there." The garden was small but well-maintained, filled with early spring flowers and a few benches where students could study in good weather. Lillian sat on one bench surrounded by 5 or 6 girls, explaining something about literature while they took notes. She looked up when Adrian approached, and her expression cycled through surprise, anxiety, and something that might have been hope. "Girls," she said, "we'll continue this tomorrow. Please finish reading the assigned chapters." The students gathered their things, whispering excitedly as they passed Adrian. When they were gone, Lillian stood. "You came," she said. "I told you I would." "I know, She twisted her hands together. "I wasn't sure you actually would." They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Adrian pulled out the speech he'd prepared, unfolded it, looked at the carefully written words, and shoved it back in his pocket. "I'm terrible at this," he said. "At saying what I mean without making it worse. So I'm just going to be honest, and if it's not enough, at least I'll know I tried." Lillian nodded, waiting. "I love you. I've loved you since that day you were scrubbing blood off the floor and refused to be intimidated by me. I loved you when we were stealing moments in the library. I loved you through the marriage and the scandal and the separation. I love you now, standing here begging you to give me another chance." He took a breath. "I can't promise everything will be perfect. I can't promise people won't talk or that there won't be consequences. But I can promise that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of you, trying to build a life where we both get to be happy. Adrian, I know you've built something here. I know you're independent and capable and you don't need me. But maybe you could want me anyway. Not because you need rescuing or protecting, but because we make each other better. Because love, even when it's complicated, is worth fighting for." He stopped, out of words, heart pounding. Lillian's eyes were bright with tears. "You idiot! That's not a yes or a no. You glorious, impossible idiot." She closed the distance between them. "Did you really think I spent 2 months agonizing over this decision just to say no?" Hope flared in Adrian's chest. "Is that a yes?" "It's a yes with conditions." She held up a hand when he started to smile. I'm not giving up my work here. I love teaching. It matters to me. I wouldn't ask you to. And I'm not going to hide who I was. I was a servant. I'm not ashamed of that. Neither am I. And if people talk, when people talk, I need to know you won't regret this. That you won't wake up 5 years from now wishing you'd chosen differently. Adrian took her hands. The only thing I regret is all the time we've wasted being apart when we could have been together. That's very romantic. Also probably not true. Probably not, he admitted, but I'm willing to risk finding out. Lillian laughed, and it sounded like the first honest laugh he'd heard from her in over a year. We're both insane for doing this. Probably that too. She kissed him then, right there in the garden where any of her students could see, and Adrian felt something in his chest that had been broken for months finally start to heal. When they pulled apart, Lillian was smiling, that real smile he'd fallen in love with, unguarded and bright. So what happens now? She asked. Now we figure it out as we go. Adrian tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Together. I like the sound of that. They stayed in the garden until the light started to fade, making plans that were half practical and half hopeful. Lillian would finish the term at the school. Adrian would handle transitioning more estate management to his stewards. They'd find a house in London, something modest, not a ducal residence, but a home. Lillian would keep teaching. Adrian would figure out what he wanted to do when he wasn't being crushed by duty and obligation. It wouldn't be easy. People would talk, and some would be cruel. There would be former allies who'd cut ties, social invitations that stopped coming, 1,000 small cruelties that came with defying expectations. But sitting there with Lillian's hand in his, watching the sunset paint the garden in shades of gold and amber, Adrian found he didn't care. For the first time in his life, he'd chosen something for himself. Not duty, not obligation, not the right thing for everyone else. Just love. Messy, complicated, imperfect love. And it turned out that was enough. 6 months later, Adrian and Lillian were married in a small ceremony with only close friends present. Marcus served as best man, Eleanor as Lillian's witness. Mrs. Rotherham attended despite her advanced age, crying through the entire service. Mrs. Hartwell brought several of Lillian's students, who treated the whole thing like the romantic ending to a novel. They honeymooned in Italy, far from England and its gossip. When they returned, they settled into the London house they'd bought together, a narrow townhouse in an unfashionable but respectable neighborhood. Lillian continued teaching. Adrian started writing about agricultural reform, using his experience to advocate for tenant rights and better estate management practices. The scandal eventually faded, as scandals always did. People found new things to gossip about. Some of Adrian's former associates remained distant, but new friendships formed with people who cared more about character than title. Eleanor visited occasionally, bringing stories about her studies and the political circles she was infiltrating with her usual strategic precision. She and Lillian had developed an odd friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to defy expectations. "You two are disgustingly happy," Eleanor observed one evening over dinner. "Is that a complaint?" Lillian asked. "Lillian. More an observation, though I suppose you've earned it after everything." Eleanor sipped her wine. "I'm thinking of writing a book about women and property law. The systematic ways we're excluded from economic power." "That sounds seditious," Adrian said. "I certainly hope so. What's the point of freedom if you don't use it to cause trouble?" A year after the wedding, Lillian discovered she was pregnant. The news terrified them both. Parenthood was another kind of responsibility, another way life could get complicated. But when their daughter was born the following spring, red-faced and screaming and absolutely perfect, Adrian understood what it meant to love something so much it hurt. They named her Catherine, after Eleanor's cousin who'd given Lillian her first real chance. "She's going to be trouble," Lillian said, watching the baby sleep in Adrian's arms. "Like her mother." "Exactly like her mother." Lillian leaned against his shoulder. "Which means she's going to be extraordinary." Adrian looked down at his daughter, then at his wife, then at the modest house they'd filled with books and mismatched furniture and evidence of a life built on their own terms. He thought about his uncle, about all the years spent trying to control him through manipulation and fear. About Eleanor, trapped in a marriage neither of them wanted. About Lillian, scrubbing floors in a house where no one saw her as anything more than a servant, All of them had been prisoners in different ways. All of them had fought to break free. Some had succeeded, some hadn't. But the ones who'd made it, they'd done it together. "What are you thinking about?" Lillian asked. "How lucky I am." "You're not lucky. You're stubborn. There's a difference." "Can I be both?" "I suppose that's allowed." She kissed him softly. "Though I'd argue I'm the lucky one. I got the library and the man who came with it." "The library was always yours?" "I know, but it's nice that you finally figured that out." Their daughter stirred, made a small noise of protest, settled back into sleep. Outside, London continued its endless rhythm, carriages rattling past, vendors calling out their wares, the ordinary chaos of a city full of people all trying to survive and maybe, if they were lucky, find something worth living for. Adrian Blackwood, formerly the Duke of Blackwood, currently just a man who'd chosen love over duty and somehow ended up with both, held his family close and thought about the future. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever was. But it would be theirs, chosen, fought for, earned. And in the end, that was everything.